At the end of our trip up and down the California coast, Elvis extended a further invitation to Sandy and me. He wanted us to spend Christmas with Priscilla and him in Memphis. The Schillings had a choice between spending the holidays in a one-bedroom apartment in Culver City or spending the holidays at Graceland. It was an easy call to make. Again, our time together was warm, easy, and wonderful. And after New Year's, when we got ready to leave as scheduled, Elvis extended his invitation. "How can you leave now? It's my birthday in a couple of days. You're going to stay for that, aren't you?" We stayed for his birthday. A beautiful dinner at Graceland followed by a night of movies at the Memphian. A week later, Sandy and I got ready to leave again, but Elvis had other plans. "I got a session to do, Jerry. Nashville. You better come along for that." So I joined Elvis and some of the guys again for a drive to Nashville, where he was supposed to record some tracks for the Stay Away Joe soundtrack, and to try to get some material done for another RCA album. This time in the studio, it was sad to watch Elvis wrestle his way through the less than impressive movie material that needed to be done. Things didn't pick up much when he turned to the material that had been pulled together for possible album tracks, and I could see that Elvis was getting more and more frustrated. He was willing to work. He was in the studio, and he couldn't get a decent song to sing. One element of the session that had kept him hopeful was the upbeat energy supplied by guitarist Jerry Reed. A couple of months earlier, Elvis had been thrilled to bring Reed into a session so that a cover of Reed's song Guitar Man could be properly recorded. Reed's songwriting had guts and smarts, and his guitar sound was gritty and dirty, and Elvis had responded well to that shot of musical adrenaline in the studio. He knocked out a killer version of Guitar Man, but then the whole deal was almost squelched when Hill and Range came down hard on Reed, pressuring him to give up a huge chunk of his publishing rights. The Colonel had set up a system that had made Elvis one of the richest entertainers in the world, but now that system was turning Elvis into an artistically starving artist in the name of adding a few more dollars to his bank accounts. Jerry Reed was in no mood to give up his song, though, and he was tough enough and smart enough to say "screw you" to Hill and Range, who consequently couldn't quite figure out a way to tell Elvis that they wouldn't go forward with a song he had gotten so excited about because it wasn't cheap enough. At this Nashville session, Jerry Reed had been called in not as a songwriter, but simply as a session guitarist. Elvis wanted to keep some of that dirt and grit in the band sound. But when he cut short a take of one uninspired number and yelled, "Doesn't anyone have some goddamn material worth recording?" Jerry came forward, a little reluctantly, with another tune titled U.S. Mail. He handed Elvis a demo, which Elvis took back to the studio's listening room. Felton Jarvis, Freddie Beanstalk, Joe Esposito, Lamar, Charlie, Red, and I were there, listening along with Elvis. He had to hear only about 20 seconds of the song before his energy shot right back up. "Let's cut it," he said. He was finally hearing something he could grab a hold of and get excited about. Freddie and Lamar, who was now working for Hill and Range, left the room, while Elvis and Felton worked out some details of the arrangement. The song should have been good news for everyone at the session, but apparently Freddie was not happy about doing business with Jerry Reed again. As I left the listening room and headed down a hall toward the studio, I saw Reed just about pinned to the wall by Freddie and Lamar. From the bits of growled threats I picked up, the message was clear. Don't you ever, ever pitch a song again at an Elvis session. The guitarist wasn't going to back down, but he didn't have much of a chance to respond because just then Elvis came around the corner, still looking up and energized. Freddie and Lamar backed off quickly, trying to make it look like they were shaking Reed's hand. "Great tune, man," Elvis said to Reed as he passed by. "We need more of that around here." A few months later, U.S. Mail came out and was a big enough hit to make plenty of money for everybody. Back at Graceland, Sandy and I again prepared to head to L.A., but again Elvis had other plans. "Jerry, you're not going to stay for the birth of our child?" We stayed, and Elvis let me know that I would serve a very important role in the baby proceedings. Perhaps because he liked the way I handled the big old limo on 17 Mile Drive, Elvis gave me the daunting responsibility of driving him and his wife to the hospital. As Priscilla's due date approached, Elvis and I went over the plan again and again, reviewing just how things would unfold and which entrance I should drive to at Methodist Hospital. I even took Elvis and Priscilla on a couple of practice runs to the hospital so that our trip there would be as quick and smooth as possible. On the morning of February 1, Sandy and I were just barely awake out in the Graceland Annex when the intercom buzzed. It was Elvis. "Hey, don't get yourself all excited, but meet me in the kitchen. Priscilla's ready to go to the hospital." I got there as fast as I could, meeting the father-to-be and Charlie Hodge. Grandma and a lot of the staff were up as well and were buzzing about from room to room in excited anticipation. I felt nervous, and Charlie looked nervous. Everybody looked nervous except for Elvis. As excitement built around him, he looked as cool and as calm as could be. So damn cool and calm that I knew he'd never been more nervous in his life. His response to this kind of anxiety was to slow himself down and act as if there were absolutely nothing in the world to worry about. Slowly, almost casually, Elvis went over the plans once more. Then we heard the yell. "Elvis, hurry up!" Priscilla was out in the front drive, trying to get herself into the car. I saw Elvis go a little pale. There was no way to slow talk through this. He and Charlie Hodge and I snapped into action and got Priscilla comfortable in the back seat. Elvis sat with her, holding her hand and trying to keep her calm. I got behind the wheel, and Charlie jumped in to ride shotgun. I got us quickly and safely to the right entrance of Methodist Hospital, just as we had planned. "It's the wrong hospital," said Charlie. I didn't know what he was talking about and ignored him. I was about to spring out of the car and get help for the mother-to-be when I heard Elvis's voice from the back seat. "It's the wrong hospital, Jerry. I forgot to tell you we switched it over to Baptist." "Oh, no," said Priscilla quietly in a strained, low voice. "Hurry." After all those careful plans for birthday transportation, I hadn't been told of the change in destination. Baptist Hospital rather than Methodist Hospital. Luckily, the two weren't far apart, although I did break a hell of a sweat trying to get over to Baptist before the back seat of the Lincoln became the delivery room. Priscilla was whisked away by nurses, and Elvis, Charlie, and I were led to a special waiting room that the hospital had set aside for Elvis. We weren't there long before we were joined by Vernon and then Joe Esposito, who had flown in from L.A. for the occasion. Throughout the day, we were joined by a few more of the boys. At first, Elvis was still keeping things calm, keeping himself cool and collected. But the more he got status reports from the doctors, the more he started to give in to the emotions of the day. You could see in his eyes how excited he was, and by the middle of the afternoon, when the rest of us were trying to stay as comfortable as we could in our chairs, Elvis couldn't keep still. He paced and bounced around the little room, hot-wired with nervous energy. At 5 p.m. he got the word. He was the father of a beautiful and healthy daughter, whom he and Priscilla named Lisa Marie. Elvis left us to spend time with mother and child, but a while later he came back grinning and led us to the hospital's nursery window so that he could proudly point out his baby to us. Priscilla and Lisa Marie were going to stay over at the hospital, and by the time Elvis was ready to go home that first day, word had gotten out about the birth, and a huge corps of press had gathered around the hospital. So another special transportation plan was put into effect. Elvis, Joe, Charlie, and I slid down laundry chutes into the hospital basement and then rode home in an anonymous-looking panel truck that Elvis thought would be right for the purposes of an undetected getaway. I drove Elvis, Priscilla, and Lisa Marie home from the hospital a couple of days later, where we were greeted by Vernon, Grandma, and the Bolyers. In the house, I had the chance to watch Elvis hold his tiny daughter. I got the feeling that whatever he had been searching for in his spiritual explorations, he had finally found a piece of right there in his arms. Whatever emptiness he had been feeling inside him was suddenly filled up by his own small family. Standing beside his beautiful wife, holding his baby, he looked like a proud husband and a natural-born dad. At some point, down there in that little kitchen, Elvis caught me looking at the baby and decided he'd share some of his happiness. "Here," he said, holding out little Lisa Marie. You want to hold her?" I think I did say no, but it was too late. He had already put the handoff into motion. Lisa was the first infant I'd ever held, and I stood there awkwardly cradling this little creature, hoping like hell I didn't drop her or damage her in any other way. My heart was pounding like a jackhammer, and though I tried to smile, I couldn't wait for the moment to be over. I'm much more comfortable around Lisa these days. I handed this incredible little package back to Elvis, who scooped her into his arms and stood there beaming down at her. He looked about as contented as a man could be. Chapter 9. A Little More Action. 1968 was a year of extremes, a year of turmoil, and a year of enormous, often violent change. Police were beating student demonstrators on American streets. Racial clashes were erupting into riots, and the war in Vietnam was starting to look unwinnable. The chaos of the headlines was reflected in the culture around us. Jimi Hendrix played his Stratocaster louder and wilder than any guitarist before him, and the Beatles, who had achieved an artistic triumph with Sgt. Pepper, were now at work on their White Album. And with beards, mustaches, and shoulder-length hair, they bore almost no resemblance to the guys that had hung out at Elvis's Perugia Way house. Muhammad Ali had been stripped of his heavyweight title and brought up on federal charges for refusing his draft induction. Down on Sunset Boulevard, the hipsters in suits had been replaced by hippies in tie-dye. In Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, the future looked to be even more confusing than the present. Old rules were being challenged, and new answers were being sought out. Thousands of people were turning to Eastern religions and philosophies, embracing some of the very same works that Elvis had read so fervently. And the Enlightenment through chemistry experiment we'd quietly attempted in the Graceland conference room had been embraced by a much wider population. Psychedelia was turning up in music, in fashion, and even on Broadway. Hair. We had a personal connection to the war effort through Priscilla's father, Colonel Bowyer, who headed over to Vietnam shortly after the birth of Lisa. Elvis had recently seen the national TV news reports of the attacks on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon during the Tet Offensive, and had learned that a military attaché at the embassy had found himself out on a balcony unarmed during the assault. Military personnel below had to toss a weapon up to him so he had some means of protection. Before Colonel Bowyer shipped out, Elvis told him, "I don't want that to ever happen to you," and gave him a snub-nosed Colt Python revolver to carry with him. In photos that Priscilla and her sister Michelle later showed us of their father overseas, it looked like he always had Elvis's gun at his side. I was standing with Elvis in a trailer on the MGM lot when we learned of one of the year's most heartbreaking events. I was still looking to get into film editing, but had continued taking on acting roles and extra work to make some money. When Elvis began work on Live a Little, Love a Little over at MGM, he hired me as his stand-in and photo double. Again, the script was uninspired and the production was hurried. The most notable details about the film are that Vernon made a cameo appearance as a high-class subject for the commercial photographer Elvis played, and I had another chance to get wet with an Elvis co-star. That's me in the Paradise Cove surf with Michelle Carey at the end of the film. Also of note, a little throwaway song Elvis sings to co-star Celeste Yarnall, A Little Less Conversation, became a global #1 hit 34 years later. But what I remember most about the production is that on April 4, I was with Elvis in his trailer hanging out between scenes. He had a little TV in there that was usually on in the background, and the set grabbed our attention when a newscaster interrupted the programming with a news bulletin from Memphis. Martin Luther King, Jr. had been shot and killed. I was confused at first. We knew that the mayor of Memphis was refusing to meet with striking sanitation workers, and that Dr. King had gone to the city to try to mediate the situation. But how could something so awful and wrong happen in the city we loved? The confusion quickly gave way to sadness. This had happened in our town, and in a terrible way, it made sense. We were well aware that beneath all the good music for good people that had come out of Memphis, there had always been an ugly racial tension. It had been there in the separate drinking fountains, in the separate counter at John's Little Kitchen, and in the struggles of Sam Phillips. It had been there in Mrs. Doolittle's reaction to 60-Minute Man, and in the early angry reactions to Elvis. Now, with one hateful bullet, that sort of ugliness was being exposed for the whole world to see. Elvis didn't often speak openly about race or politics, but he had been greatly inspired by Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, and had committed much of it to memory. I had heard him recite those beautiful, hopeful words many times. I looked over at Elvis now and saw that he was staring hard at the TV. There were tears in his eyes. "He always spoke the truth," he said quietly. By the end of April, I had finally gotten a chance to work as a film editor, or more accurately, in an editing department. I found myself reporting to the basement of one of the post-production buildings at ABC Television, where it was my responsibility to scrape the labels off the cans of film that had come back from overseas syndication runs. I'd been trying to get in over at ABC for months, and the guy who finally hired me, Jim Taylor, admitted that he'd been reluctant at first to give me a job. "I knew you were one of Elvis's guys," he said. "I didn't think you could be serious about working as an editor." Scraping labels in the basement wasn't exactly the mix of artistry and craft that had attracted me to editing in the first place, but I liked the routine of a steady day job and enjoyed earning my living through my own hands-on work. Sandy took a job at the Casual Corner, a women's clothing store in Century City, and we started to settle into a happy, humble domestic life. And after a couple of months of scraping, I got bumped up to a position with a team of assistant editors cutting together the footage for the network news. I got to put some of my old backfield moves to use, running fresh footage from cameramen's helicopters down to the editing bays. I didn't see much of Elvis for a while, but I stayed in touch with Joe Esposito and some of the other guys. I heard that Elvis had taken them back to Hawaii for a vacation trip. I also heard that he had signed on to do his first television special, which was being shot all through June over at the NBC studios. I couldn't get away from work for any of the tapings, but I felt like I was represented by Sandy, who went one afternoon with Priscilla, Pat Perry, and Joni Esposito. Sandy reported that Elvis looked great and sang some of his older hits. I hoped that Elvis was having a better time making his special than he had making his last few films. "Come on out to Arizona and let your beard grow." The call from Elvis was an invitation to join him on location for production of a film that sounded like it might actually be exciting. A gritty cowboy tale in the mold of Clint Eastwood's spaghetti westerns, to be titled El Charro. He wanted me to work again as his stand-in and photo double. It meant a lot that he was keeping me a part of things, and I had to admit that even though I liked working on my own, it wasn't easy to hear about something like that Hawaii vacation trip without wishing, just a little, that I'd been a part of it. At ABC, I was moving up again, joining editor Bud Tedesco's staff to assemble preview footage of the network's upcoming shows so that they could be introduced and sold to the network's affiliates. That work didn't start until the fall, and I used vacation days and some favors from my bosses to get enough time off to accept Elvis's invitation and become a bearded cowboy that August at the Apache Land Movie Ranch in Apache Junction, Arizona. When I got out to the location, I could see that the production was in trouble. This hadn't been set up as the typical soundstage shoot, and a better-than-usual cast had been assembled for the film, including Ina Balin, Victor French, and Barbara Whirl. Elvis had had some hopes that this might be a meaningful film, but the edgy script that had caught Elvis's interest was being rewritten and toned down. The crew seemed to be broken into factions, and to top it all off, the stuntmen had gone on strike. A pretty big problem for a film full of gunfighting, fist-fighting, and horse riding. I was asked if I wanted to do some stunt work in addition to my photo double duties. Thinking of the much higher day rate that stuntmen made and all my experience in the saddle at Graceland and the Circle G, I said yes. I was part of a big scene in which a group of desperados on horses tried to cross a river while being shot at by a cannon. We were to ride through the water as two large, precisely timed charges of real dynamite buried in the river went off to create the effect of incoming cannonballs. Everything about the scene was carefully thought through, except the strength of the river's current. On action, we charged into the water, and the first blast went off right in front of us. It was much bigger than what had been described to us, and spooked both horses and riders. While everyone tried to rein in their mounts, the river pushed us toward the second charge, which turned out to be not so precisely timed. It didn't go off until we were right over it. The scene was a disaster, with both people and horses getting hurt. But with our schedule and budget, there was no chance for a second take. The scene made the final cut. As the shoot days limped along, it was still great to spend time with Elvis and some of the guys. Charlie Hodge had a role in the film as Mexican Peon. One morning I was up at dawn, before any of the other guys, for an early call. I headed over to the ranch cafeteria for a quick breakfast, and saw that one other person had gotten there before me. He was an older man with long silvery hair, dressed all in black. I had never met him before, but I knew right away that this was Billy Murphy, a semi-legendary character actor and buddy of John Wayne's and Robert Mitchum's, who had spent a lot of time with Elvis in the early L.A. days. Seemed like everybody that had met Billy Murphy had a great oddball story about him, and I had heard Elvis tell enough Billy stories that I had no doubt about who I was looking at. I walked over to his table. "Mr. Murphy?" "Sit down, mister," he said, almost as if he'd been expecting me. There was no mistaking that mister. I'd heard Elvis say it just the same way countless times. "What are you doing here? How'd you get here?" I asked. "Got in the Saint. Followed the sun," he said. This was pure Billy. Part philosopher, part poet, all cowboy. It was a while before I learned that the Saint was his trusty beat-up old car. Billy hadn't made any arrangements with Elvis. He had just shown up on the set, on his way to another Arizona location where a Robert Mitchum film was being shot. As soon as I had a chance, I got over to the location house where Elvis was staying and told him Billy was out here. Elvis was excited by the news. As always, he loved a character, and Billy was much more than that. He was a truly unique personality that Elvis enjoyed spending time with. Elvis asked me to make arrangements with the assistant directors to get Billy into a few scenes of the film. A couple of days later, we were shooting a night scene, and Elvis was in a director's chair off to the side, watching the action. He called me over and pointed to Billy, who in the scene was walking down the western street with a distinctive cowboy strut. "Jerry, take a look at Billy over there. You see that walk?" "Yeah, I used that walk in my TV special." From the Memphis trucker's neckerchiefs to James Dean's upturned collar to Billy Murphy's strut, Elvis always had a knack of borrowing from the best, and the most unlikely, and making it his own. After Chato wrapped, Elvis wanted to head to Las Vegas for a couple of days of fun, and he asked me to come along. We still had matching beards, matching hair, and quite frequently matching miniature Villager Keel cigars. Our first night in Vegas, we went down to a blackjack table, and when management spotted us, they put up some red velvet ropes around us. Of course, this only called more attention to us, and I guess maybe the matching beards confused a few people because suddenly there was a woman at my side asking me for an autograph. I don't know who she thought I was, but I was trying to ignore the request. I figured I didn't need to be signing autographs when I was standing next to Elvis Presley. The woman was insistent, though, and it seemed like the situation might get uncomfortable. Suddenly Elvis gave me a nudge and, with his cigar held in his teeth, said, "Go ahead, sign it." I turned to the lady and signed the first Jerry Schilling autograph of my life. Turning back to Elvis, I think I saw just the barest hint of a smile as he pushed his next stack of chips out on the table. Tanned, thin, dangerous, and singing straight from the soul. Elvis was back with a vengeance. I was sitting in a small conference room at NBC watching a rough cut of Elvis's TV special. It was just Elvis, myself, Joe, and Charlie, along with producer-director Steve Binder and a network executive. I don't know what I'd expected this show to be, but from the first moment to the last, it was obvious that Binder had allowed it to become the kind of artistic challenge Elvis had been so hungry for. For the first time in a long time, somebody had let Elvis be Elvis, rather than the tame, nice guy next door he'd had to play in so many films, and he rose to the occasion in a spectacular way. The special's loose storyline was guided along by Jerry Reed's Guitar Man, and the set pieces combined gospel music, modern dance, karate moves, and always Elvis in peak voice. There was an informal jam that teamed Elvis with Scotty Moore, DJ Fontana, Charlie Hodge, and Lance Legault, as well as Alan Fortas, who contributed what he could by tapping on the back of a guitar case. There was also a solo performance during which Elvis ripped through some of his old favorites. In both sequences, Elvis was in black leather pants and jacket, and at 33 looking better than ever. This show didn't have a studio feel, a network feel, or a Colonel feel. The whole thing had a true Elvis feel to it. And yes, there was a little Billy Murphy in his walk. The special ended with a song written for the occasion, a plea for peace and brotherhood, called If I Can Dream. The shock and hurt of the loss of Dr. King and then Robert Kennedy was still heavy in the air, and Elvis gave himself over completely to the stirring music and the simple message of hope. It was a breathtaking performance, and the pain, the power, and the heart that went into it made one thing very clear to me in that little conference room. The guy who had created all that excitement back in the 50s could still, in the turmoil of 1968, move you to tears with his awesome, undimmed talent. Nobody had originally talked about this as a comeback special, but Elvis had turned it into one. We all shared our positive feedback with Elvis after the screening, and I know that meant a lot to him. I don't think he really knew how good the show was until he'd seen it cut together that night. But he was still a little pensive. It had been a long time since he'd put himself out like this to the public, and I think he was actually nervous about what the public's reaction would be. His nerves probably weren't helped much by the Colonel's opinion of the special. Right from the start, the Colonel had disagreed with the approach Elvis and Binder had taken, and he still wasn't won over by the results of their work when he had his own screening at the network. Originally, he'd envisioned the program to be more along the lines of a traditional Christmas special, Elvis singing holiday standards a la Bing Crosby. But Elvis and Binder had stuck to their guns, and when the show aired in early December, it was a critical success and a rating smash that delighted old-time fans and let a whole new generation of fans see what really made Elvis, Elvis. Through the fall and winter of 1968, I went back to steady work as an editor at ABC, though I did take advantage of a couple of days off to walk from my apartment over to the MGM lot, where Elvis was working his way through his final film for the studio, The Trouble with Girls. I couldn't get the time off to be a stand-in, but I did score a couple of days' work as a deputy sheriff. Soon after that production wrapped, Elvis headed back to Memphis to begin some new recording sessions. Re-energized by the reaction to the special, Elvis was now eager to start making quality records again, and after some encouragement from George Klein and Marty Lacker, he decided to shake things up. Rather than lining up another round of the usual recording process in L.A. or Nashville, he teamed with a young, hot producer named Chips Moman at Moman's low-budget American Studios in North Memphis. In that small, run-down facility, not so far from Humes High and Leith Street, Moman, who'd been a creative force behind many successes at Stax Records, quickly proved that he also knew how to let Elvis be Elvis. Those North Memphis sessions would produce some of Elvis's best work, including In the Ghetto and Suspicious Minds. In the spring, Elvis was spending a lot of time in Palm Springs, and I developed an interesting weekend ritual. I'd spend the week as a hard-working, low-paid apprentice editor, but at Friday quitting time, I'd drive over to Santa Monica Airport to be flown out by private plane for a weekend in the desert with Elvis and the guys. The Colonel had been the first big advocate of weekends in Palm Springs. He was out there doing business and encouraged Elvis to come out for weekend getaways. The idea of being able to keep a close eye on Elvis had an appeal to the Colonel, but the appeal of Palm Springs wasn't so clear to us guys at first. It seemed like a town of old folks that didn't have much to offer. The desert destination grew on us, though. There was fun to be had out there. Everything from an active nightlife to a shooting range to a run of giant sand dunes that we used for afternoons of wild dune buggy rides. For a while, Palm Springs was a great getaway for all of us, with Elvis and Priscilla and the guys and their wives enjoying the place as a mix of romantic hideout and family resort. Sometimes Elvis, Priscilla, Sandy, and I would go over to the Colonel's house in the late afternoon to spend some time with him and his wife. These get-togethers were generally pleasant, unless Elvis and the Colonel decided they needed to head out by the pool for a private meeting, in which case I'd be stuck playing Yahtzee with the girls, watching Marie Parker cheat her way through game after game and listening to her constantly reprimand Priscilla for dressing too sexy. We traveled a little farther for a getaway in May of 1969, when Elvis and Priscilla invited Sandy and me and several other couples to join them for a Hawaiian vacation. I lined up some days off to make the trip and was very happy to find myself back at the Ilikai Hotel, where I'd been staying when I first met Sandy. In between our nights at the Ilikai, we also stayed in some beach houses on the other side of the island. By the end of May, the Circle G Ranch would be sold, but that Hawaiian trip had some of the easy, carefree feel of some of the best ranch times. One night, Priscilla, Sandy, and Joni Esposito decided to make a taco dinner for everyone over at Elvis's beach house. Something must have sparked that competitive spirit in Elvis and me, because we decided to have a taco eating contest. I thought I had him beat when I wolfed down 12 of them, but he went on to edge me out by putting away a 13th. Toward the end of the trip, we decided we needed to treat the wives to something a little fancier than competitive eating. We wanted to give them a special night out and a chance to get dressed up, so we made plans to dine at the Ilikai's rooftop restaurant, Top of the Eye. We had a great meal in a private alcove in the dining area up there. There was good food and a lot of laughter, and even though he was out in a fairly exposed public place, Elvis was relaxed and enjoying himself. Toward the end of dinner, he got up to use the restroom and asked me to come along with him. Even back at the Memphian, he always brought someone along on a bathroom trip. He didn't want to get cornered when he was at his most vulnerable. We were on our way back to the table when he suddenly left my side and headed for the maitre d's station. Apparently, he had noticed that there were a number of people lined up there waiting to be seated. Elvis walked directly over to the station and addressed the first person in line. "Yes, party of?" he asked. "Miller, party of 4, said a well-dressed middle-aged woman. "Table for 4, said Elvis. He picked up a pen and made a note in the reservation book, then began to look around the restaurant for an open table. The woman had a puzzled expression on her face. "Excuse me, are you—" "I get that all the time," said the pinch-hitting maitre d'. The other people waiting to be seated started to realize who was now handling their reservations. The real maitre d' now hurried back to his station, looking a little surprised that a VIP guest had found it necessary to step in for him. "This man will take excellent care of you. Enjoy your dinner," said Elvis with a devilish grin. Slowly, the Palm Springs weekends began to shift away from the couples and families, and the stays in the desert started to have more of a boys' club feel. At Elvis's Palm Springs houses, he went through a few of them, we kept late hours, and the weekends took on the feeling of a more adult version of the old Graceland parties or the nights at the Perugia Way house. Along with Joe and Charlie, the guys at this point included Sonny West, Richard Davis, Gigi Gamble, and a few others. L.A. friends like Pat Perry might come down and join us, and just as a few pretty girls had made it through the Graceland gates, there were some L.A. and Palm Springs women who'd come hang out with us. There was still very little drinking. I don't remember a stocked bar at any of the Palm Springs houses. There was some music, some storytelling, some laughs, and, with our new guests, some new relationships. When we got out of the house, the boys had some interesting encounters with the Palm Springs locals. We'd find ourselves hanging out for a night at Liberace's house, or riding around in a Rolls-Royce Elvis had borrowed from Sammy Davis, Jr., at Sammy's insistence. One night around midnight, Elvis was driving the Rolls along Palm Canyon Drive when he spotted the silhouette of someone walking across the road up ahead, holding a golf club. "I think that's Bob Hope," he said. And as he pulled up to the pedestrian, we saw that it was indeed Mr. Hope, accompanied by his valet. Elvis got out of the car and talked with Bob for a while and made a point of introducing me and Joe to him. Just another night out for all of us. I felt like I was back to leading a double life. On Sundays, I'd be riding around in Liberace's doom buggy, equipped with a pair of chandeliers, and on Monday morning I'd be punching the clock for a day of film splicing. I'm pretty sure I was the only apprentice editor whose Monday morning commute included limos and charter planes. By the middle of 1969, Elvis and I had both made important career moves. After putting in my year of apprentice work in television editing, I was hired at Paramount as an apprentice editor on feature films. This meant that I now spent my days lugging around the heavy cans of 35mm film from the lot's film library to projection rooms for directors' screenings. It wasn't exciting work, but the days were sometimes broken up with some interesting encounters. I helped the Brady Bunch's Maureen McCormick carry her bags of fan mail to her dressing room, and I sometimes worked the heavy bag in the studio gym alongside Bonanza's Michael Landon. Elvis's career move may have been a little more exciting. After more than 8 years away from the concert stage, he decided to make a return to live performance at the end of July with a month-long concert engagement at the brand-new International Hotel in Las Vegas. At that point, it had become a part of the rhythm of our friendship that, even though I wasn't working for him, I'd be involved in what was happening around him. So I was there at the RCA studio in Hollywood for most of the band auditions, as Elvis carefully selected the players who would back him in Vegas. He started by picking guitarist James Burton, a masterful player whose credits ranged from Ricky Nelson to Shindig to Frank Sinatra's sessions. Then, with Burton as a musical anchor, Elvis built up his band, musician by musician. With the TV special still fresh in people's minds and In the Ghetto now at the top of the singles charts, Elvis could have his pick of the top players in the business. But he didn't just automatically go after the players generally considered to be the number one session guys. He wanted musicians who played with some character, too. After so many years of slickly recorded soundtrack sessions, he now wanted a band that would surprise people. After all those years of having his voice pushed up in the mix and the instruments pushed back, Elvis wanted a band that would kick some ass. The key to the band's power would be the rhythm section. Burton brought in a guy named Jerry Sheff, who played what Elvis would always describe as a thundering bass. But the band still needed a drummer. With just a few weeks to go until opening night, it was assumed that Elvis would go with one of the top L.A. session drummers who had already auditioned. But on the last day of auditions, another drummer showed up. He was a big, bearded guy named Ronnie Tutt, who had just come to L.A. from Texas. In fact, he had his family, his station wagon, and a trailer full of all his earthly belongings parked outside the studio. I don't think anybody had high expectations for Ronnie. He didn't have anything close to the kind of concert and recording credits the rest of the band had, and when he first played with the band, it didn't seem like he impressed his bandmates all that much. But Elvis heard something, and he wanted to hear more of it. He told the drummer they were going to run through some more songs, and this time Elvis wanted him to use the drums to accentuate the moves he made while he sang. They started a song, Elvis started moving, and you could see Ronnie trying to keep the beat solid while punching drum licks to accent what Elvis was doing. Elvis kept calling out more directions to the drummer, telling him to follow the moves and hit the accents harder. Ronnie's brow started to furrow, and a dark look showed up in his eyes. He was keeping the songs rolling and doing his damnedest to bash out those accents. He started to look like he was playing angry. The whole band's energy seemed to jump, but when the song was over, the other players probably still assumed that they'd be working in Vegas with a dependable session ace behind the drums. Elvis came over to where I was standing with Joe and Charlie and some other guys. Somebody asked if he was going to go with a well-known established drummer. It seemed obvious that the answer would be yes, but Elvis surprised us. "I need somebody on stage who plays with my temperament," said Elvis, "and the guy with the beard's got it." As usual, when Elvis was allowed to make his own decision about his music, he made the right one. Ronnie Tutt could match Elvis's temperament, and temper, move for move, song for song. And he'd go on to be recognized as one of the most powerful drummers in the business. My work schedule at Paramount prevented me from being in Las Vegas for the big opening night on Thursday, July 31. But I'll never forget the report I got from Joe Esposito when I called him to make arrangements for Sandy and me to be there the next night. Joe said Elvis was phenomenal, and the sold-out crowd loved every second of it. But the detail that stood out the most to me was this. After the show, the Colonel had come backstage with a tear in his eye. Without saying a word, he had walked up to Elvis, and the two had embraced. You could see, Joe said, that the Colonel was shaking, and Elvis looked just as moved. The Colonel got what Elvis was doing, and for that moment, they'd looked closer than they ever had before. Sandy and I were there the next night to see the show for ourselves, and it was just as thrilling as Joe had indicated. Elvis was in a striking white-on-white suit that had the look of a tailored karate gi, with a low collar and a loose cloth belt tied around his lean frame. As he kicked things off with a rocking version of blue suede shoes, I could see right away that everything I had always admired about Elvis as a performer was still there. The jungle animal on the prowl instincts I'd seen at Ellis Auditorium back in 1956 were right back up on the Vegas stage, but that raw energy had now been channeled and choreographed into a more powerful physical display of athleticism, including a lot of explosive karate moves. The wild animal had been trained, but not tamed. The band I'd seen Elvis put together did in fact kick ass, but he also had a string and horn section up on stage with him, along with a pair of backup singing groups, a quartet of white gospel singers called the Imperials, and a quartet of beautiful black female singers called the Sweet Inspirations. It occurred to me that on this one stage, Elvis had brought together elements of every musical influence that had in some way shaped him. Black gospel, white gospel, country guitar licks, the earthiness of rhythm and blues, the drive of rock and roll. Even the orchestral sweep of the Mario Lanza records he had loved as a kid was part of the act now. That was a lot to try to hold together, but he did it. And the timing, pacing, and dynamics of the show were unbelievable. The show moved with a steady, natural flow from the high-energy opening of Blue Suede Shoes to the power of Suspicious Minds, to surprises like Del Shannon's Runaway and the Beatles' Hey Jude, right on through to the emotional finale of I Can't Help Falling in Love with You. It wasn't until that Vegas show that I realized how much I'd missed watching him do what he could do on a concert stage. His performance had all the enthusiasm and intensity that he had brought to his TV special, but the stage gave him a freedom that he hungrily seized upon. He wasn't just the rebel anymore, singing to an underground audience. He was more in charge and more exciting. A master performer. Back at Ellis, he had dragged his mic around as if it were putting up a fight for its honor. Now there was no question that Elvis was the triumphant seducer. The bad scripts and the gimmicks and the interference had finally been swept away. This was his room, his band, his show, and his music. Against all odds, the tiger was back, strong and sleek and ferocious as ever. In the fall, Elvis and Priscilla headed to Hawaii for an island vacation. The trip was paid for by the International Hotel as a thank you for Elvis's engagement, which had set new attendance and box office records in Las Vegas. The couple took the Espositos and Gambles along with them. I was back to my day shifts at Paramount, but a few days after the group had left for the island, I got a call at home. "You got a passport, Jerry?" "No, Elvis. Why would I need one?" "The island's real nice, but we've been talking. We need a real vacation. We're all going to Europe in a couple of weeks. I want you and Sandy to come." The idea sounded great, but I'd known Elvis long enough to know that sometimes his great ideas weren't thought through all the way. "I can probably get the time off to do it, E, but are you sure the Colonel's going to let it happen?" "He ain't got a goddamn thing to do with it. None of his goddamn business. We're going to Europe. Are you coming?" "Well, sure, Elvis, yeah. It sounds perfect." I put in the request to use up my 2 weeks' worth of vacation days for the year at Paramount, and when Elvis and the rest returned from Hawaii, we all set about getting expedited passports. There were a few days of high spirits as the wives began to plan the cities they wanted to visit and the sights they wanted to see, but predictably, a European vacation didn't sound so perfect to the Colonel. As soon as he heard about Elvis's plan, he came down hard on him, insisting that it would be a terrible insult to European fans to take a vacation there before he'd ever performed there. This didn't make a lot of sense to anybody, and at first it seemed like Elvis, charged up and riding high on his new string of career successes, would simply ignore the Colonel. But before our European itinerary could even be set, Elvis announced that there would be a change in plans. We wouldn't be heading to Europe. We'd be heading to the Bahamas. The Colonel knew the owner of the main hotel on Paradise Island off Nassau, and had arranged for us to have a spectacular vacation stay there. Elvis was a strong, smart guy, but he also hated conflict. I'm sure that once the Colonel was on him, telling him that he was making a thoughtless mistake, at some point it just seemed a lot easier to stop arguing back and head off to the Bahamas. We all tried to get over the disappointment, and tried to concentrate on the chance for all of us to have a great time together. After all, how bad could a place called Paradise Island be? We flew into the island's small airport at sunset and checked into the hotel. Then Joe and I went down to the nearby docks to rent some boats we could use the next day. Elvis wanted to water ski. We had a nice dinner together in the hotel restaurant, then headed off to our separate rooms. The room phone woke me up the next day, and I was surprised to hear Elvis's voice on the other end. In all the years I knew him, there weren't many mornings when he was up before me. "You ready to hit those boats?" he asked. Despite the early hour, he sounded like he was in a great mood. "Yeah, Elvis, just waking up over here, but yeah." "Well, take a look out your window." I put the phone down, walked over to the window, and parted the heavy drapes. The sky was dark and angry-looking, and the wind was so strong it was whipping bullets of rain sideways through the sky. Half the palm trees on the beach had been knocked over, and down at the dock, the boats, including the ones we'd rented, were tangled and tossed and smashed together. We had come to the island just in time to sit in the middle of a brewing hurricane, a violent storm front that didn't let up for days. We ended up hitting the casinos instead of the beach and managed to have some fun together, but we came back to L.A. a week early, all very conscious of the fact that our grand plan for 2 weeks in Europe had been reduced to 6 days of Bahama hurricane. My new passport was still unstamped, and a combination of bad weather and Colonel Parker had wasted away my hard-earned Paramount vacation days. In early 1970, Elvis was as free as he'd been in a long time. He had finally fulfilled all the obligations of his film contracts and didn't have any upcoming recording sessions. He also had a #1 hit single. Suspicious Minds had made it to the top of the pop charts in November. For the first time in a long while, I got the sense that he was really enjoying what he was doing, and it didn't surprise anybody when he booked another month-long engagement at the International in Vegas. I had worked myself up to a higher position at Paramount. Instead of just moving film cans around, I was now doing some hands-on editing. I was working with the syndication department, splicing out the foreign commercials that had been spliced in when the features aired on overseas television, and making sure that the prints were in good enough shape to be sent out again. I enjoyed the work, and loved putting my skills to use, cutting and restoring those 16mm feature prints. And I still felt like I had the best of both worlds. Most of my Paramount work weeks ended with an Elvis-hired plane whisking me off to Las Vegas. Elvis knew me well enough to know that I didn't want to feel like I was getting something for nothing, so he started giving me some unofficial duties when I was out in Vegas with him. I became a kind of personal PR man, helping with special arrangements for stars that wanted to come see the show, and making sure that certain guests got an introduction to Elvis. I was also put to use as an extra member of Elvis's security team. Among the guys working full-time for Elvis, Joe Esposito handled the VIPs, and Red or Sonny West was always in charge of security. But when things got crazy and those guys got busy, I was there to help as an all-purpose utility man. One weekend in this period, I found myself back out in Palm Springs with the Colonel, rather than with Elvis. The Colonel had invited Sandy and me out for a visit. He was putting us up in the Palm Springs spa and wanted us to come to a dinner there with him and Marie and another couple, a Los Angeles promoter, manager, and former talent agent named Jerry Weintraub and his wife, the singer Jane Morgan. The invitation was a little unusual. The Colonel and I had stayed on good terms, but it seemed strange that he'd have me be a part of a business dinner, and I knew there was no such thing as a purely social dinner with the Colonel. If he was talking, he was doing business. Elvis's incredible success in Las Vegas had gotten the entertainment world very excited, and now there was a buzz about his heading out on the road for more concert appearances. If and when that happened, the Colonel was going to need some help to help mount a tour. Jerry Weintraub wanted to be a part of that venture. I'd seen that the Colonel usually liked to have a staff guy like Tom Diskin or George Parkhill at any business meeting to serve as a friendly witness. I felt that at this dinner, I was in that role. It was actually nice to spend some time with the Colonel, and as usual, though he didn't talk in direct business terms at the dinner table, you got the feeling that everything he said had some strategy behind it, and that everything Weintraub said was being very carefully assessed. Weintraub was an outgoing and charismatic young guy, and we got along well enough that before he left, he asked me to get in touch with him back in L.A. It seemed like a good contact. I was trying to catch a break in the business, and knowing a guy like Weintraub couldn't hurt. The Colonel thought otherwise. No sooner had Weintraub's car sped away than the old snowman came up next to me, took a puff off his cigar, and said, "Stay away from that guy. You don't need to get together with him." I didn't know if the Colonel was looking out for my interests or if he wanted to keep me out of his. I was pretty sure it was the latter. Elvis did get on the road again, and he restarted his touring career in a typically big way. On the last weekend of February 1970, he did 6 shows at the Houston Astrodome, headlining the annual Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. The huge venue, just a few years old at the time, was the first indoor baseball-football stadium, air-conditioned against the Texas heat, and was still being billed as the 8th wonder of the world. I flew into Houston to be a part of the team for the weekend and got over to the Astrodome Hotel where I met up with Elvis, Vernon, and the guys. There was a bit of the usual kidding around, but the atmosphere was more strained than usual. It was clear to everybody that Elvis was extremely nervous about the shows. Band rehearsals had been difficult because of the cavernous acoustics of the Astrodome and the size of the crowd. The place could hold nearly 50,000 people, made it a huge jump from the Las Vegas gigs. We were taken to the Astrodome on a bus driven by the legendary race car driver A.J. Foyt, a surprise the Colonel had arranged. The bus pulled into the loading area of the venue and drove up a tunnel that was curtained off from the field and the seats. A part of the rodeo had just finished. The lights were down, and we could just barely see what we were about to head into. Elvis was at the front of the bus, getting ready to disembark, when the curtain before us was pulled open and the lights came up inside. Elvis was overwhelmed. I was standing close to him, and I could see that he was physically shaken. He went pale and came very close to being physically ill. The stage was out in the dome's center field, and nobody in the audience was going to have a chance to see the show up close, so the plan had been that Elvis would do a kind of pre-show victory lap. He'd stand in a Jeep and be driven near the seats so that he could make some personal contact with fans before performing. Sonny, Red, and Vernon were going to ride in the Jeep with him. Now, looking out at this space and this crowd, he wanted a little extra support. "Jerry, you better ride with us," he said quietly, still looking white as a ghost. We took our places in the Jeep, Elvis standing and holding on to the top of the windshield, and began our slow drive around the edge of the seating areas. The crowd immediately came to its feet and greeted Elvis with a roaring ovation. Elvis was high enough in the vehicle that as we drove he could reach out and shake hands with people, and they could reach out and touch him. I was hunched down next to him, helping him stay up, and as I listened to that crowd roar, I had the sensation that I was in the Roman Colosseum, hanging onto the leg of a Caesar. Hearing that roar and seeing the excitement he created, a single thought kept coming back to me. Oh my God, I forgot who this guy was. Despite the welcoming, Elvis was not at all happy with that first Friday matinee show. He went directly from being nervous beforehand to being dejected afterward. Once we'd gotten out to the center field stage, we could see that the venue was only half full. In addition to that discouraging fact, Elvis felt he hadn't been able to deliver the kind of performance he wanted to, partly due to the unpredictability of the event's revolving stage. "I finished Love Me Tender and I was singing to a cow," he muttered back at the hotel. In the hotel room between the afternoon and evening shows, Elvis started being hard on himself, saying that not only was the afternoon show a failure, but telling us that it was a mistake to think he could pull in a crowd big enough for a venue this size. A Vegas engagement was one thing, but as far as grassroots fans were concerned, he just didn't have it anymore. We tried to tell him that you couldn't expect much from a Friday afternoon show. People who wanted to be there were still at work. That didn't do much to lift his spirits. But then somebody called him over to his room's window. From our vantage point at the top of the hotel, we could see that traffic was streaming in from every direction to get to the Astrodome. He watched for a while, and then he started smiling. You could see all his uncertainty slip away, replaced by the confidence he'd been bringing to the Las Vegas stage. Obviously, a guy who could create a traffic jam that size still had a few fans. He did a great show Friday night for a crowd that set attendance records, and he did more great shows and set more records throughout the weekend. Even the cows must have been impressed. By the end of the summer, Elvis was back in Vegas for his third engagement at the International, and I was spending more weekends at home in L.A., either enjoying time with Sandy or putting in longer hours at Paramount. One Friday afternoon, I got a call at work from Joe Esposito. He told me that Elvis wanted to speak with me. In a moment, Elvis was on the line. "Jerry, I need you out here tonight. I've sent a plane. I'll explain it to you when you get here." I didn't know what was going on, but from the sound of Elvis's voice, I knew it was serious. I bolted out of work and drove over to Santa Monica Airport, where a Lear jet was waiting to take me to Vegas. I got to the International about 10 minutes before Elvis was to go on and was immediately led backstage. He was in a little dressing area in front of his makeup mirror, and when he saw me, I detected some conflicting emotions in his expression. He was glad I was there, but he was also clearly angry and upset. Something had gotten to him. It wasn't common for us to make a big deal about greeting each other, but this time we embraced. Suddenly it felt incredibly important to be standing there with him, to be right here beside him when he needed help. "Let me show you what's going on," he said. He picked up a piece of paper. It was one of the promotional menus for the engagement with his picture on it, except that on this one Elvis's face had been crossed out, and something unreadable was scrawled across it. "Read it backwards," he said. The scrawled letters spelled out, "I am going to kill you." "Some son of a bitch slid this under my door. The FBI says it looks like the real thing and we have to take it seriously. The hotel said I didn't have to do the show, but I'm not going to let this motherfucker push me off the stage. I wanted you and Red and Sonny here to watch my back. I'm here, E." Elvis stared down at his defaced picture, and his anger seemed to push his fear out of the way. "Listen to me, Jerry. I don't want anybody going around saying they killed Elvis Presley. If anything happens out there, forget about me. You go get the son of a bitch and rip his eyes out." Elvis wanted Sonny and me on stage with him. I was going to take a position behind the piano, with Sonny behind the backup singers on the other side of the stage. Red would be out in the audience, along with Ed Parker, a dynamic karate instructor Elvis had become friendly with. All of us would be carrying our own guns, and Elvis would have a small pistol packed into his boot. There were also FBI agents out on the floor. Sonny and I talked briefly about what our best plan of action would be if we heard a shot. We decided that the first guy who could get to Elvis would bring him down fast to the floor, and the second guy would drop over him. The backstage area was below stage level, and as we made our way up the stairs toward the stage just a minute before showtime, I noticed that one of Elvis's personal doctors, Dr. Thomas Flash Newman, was there, which was not part of the normal routine before a show. As we continued walking, Elvis nodded over to the open doors of the loading bay at the back of the building, where an ambulance and a crew of paramedics waited. The show started on time, and the band members were understandably a little tense. Everybody knew what was going on. They were also trying to get used to the fact that Sonny and I were now armed members of the orchestra. Elvis put on a strong performance, though he never stayed in one spot long, and he tried harder than usual to see past the stage lights and keep an eye on the crowd. Somewhere toward the middle of the show, there was a quiet moment before Elvis was to sing one of his ballads. The lights went down on stage until the orchestra was in darkness, and Elvis was lit with a single spotlight. Just before the song began, the quiet was pierced by a male shout from the balcony, "Elvis!" I reached for my gun and was ready to make my move toward Elvis. I saw Sonny was ready to do the same. Down in the front of the house, Red was looking toward the voice from above, ready to go for his gun. Elvis immediately dropped to one knee and turned his body sideways, using a defensive karate strategy to make himself the smallest possible target. "Yeah?" he growled back angrily at the balcony voice. If this was the son of a bitch who had threatened him, he wasn't going to give him any satisfaction. "Would you sing Hound Dog?" the balcony voice asked. I don't think I've ever seen Elvis take a request so quickly, and I don't believe I've ever heard Hound Dog played any faster than it was that night. We made it through the show without any further incident, and the menu-mangling potential assassin was never heard from again. Not every moment around Elvis was quite that exciting, but even a quiet night at his home could turn into an interesting adventure. I was visiting Elvis and Priscilla at their latest home on Hillcrest Drive in Beverly Hills, after Elvis had completed a 6-city mini-tour. I was in the den talking with Patsy and Gigi, who also lived there, when the in-house phone rang. I picked it up. Elvis was on the other end. "Jerry, come back to the bedroom. I want to show you something." I headed to the room and found Elvis and Priscilla standing side by side, looking at a piece of paper that Elvis was holding. I knew it couldn't be another death threat because Elvis had a great, big, uncharacteristic grin on his face. He was clearly thrilled with whatever he was looking at. He carefully handed me the paper and said, "What do you think?" It was good to see Elvis this enthusiastic, to see him full of almost boyish excitement. I didn't want to say anything to sour that mood, but frankly I had no idea what I was looking at on this paper. It was a drawing of something, a lightning bolt with letters on it. "God, Elvis, this is great. What is it?" "It's a TCB," he said proudly. He and Priscilla looked at each other and smiled. "Oh." I looked a little harder at the drawing. What's a TCB?" "Taking care of business. Picture it in gold on a chain. Priscilla sketched it out on the plane from Memphis. You're going to get one. All the guys will get one. It'll be our thing." Now I could see it, and the lightning bolt with the TCB around it did make a striking jewelry design. Elvis had a favorite jeweler in Beverly Hills, Sol Schwartz, from whom he had purchased a number of pieces. I knew he'd want Schwartz to make up these, and I offered to bring the design to Sol's shop the next day. That wasn't good enough for Elvis. It was already past midnight, but he wanted to meet with the jeweler immediately. Elvis had done enough special order business with Schwartz that he had his home numbers, so I gave him a call and asked if he'd come meet us at the shop. Mr. Schwartz didn't seem too upset about having his sleep interrupted, especially for an Elvis request, and a short while later I was with Elvis and Priscilla outside the shop on Beverly Drive as the jeweler turned the alarms off and the lights on. Elvis and Priscilla presented the sketch to him and explained the design. The jeweler made a few notes, then took the order for the very first dozen 14-karat gold TCBs. And while the TCBs may have started as a late-night whim, they would become the most cherished of Inner Circle possessions. Chapter 10. All the Way from Memphis. I'd gotten used to the fact that my life could change very quickly with a call from Elvis, calls to come join him on a movie set, invitations to Palm Springs and Las Vegas, an intercom call to come check out a jewelry design. Still, nothing quite prepared me for a call I got one Saturday night just before Christmas 1970, or the events it led to. I guess the work at Paramount and some of those Elvis weekends had caught up with me. I had fallen asleep early, and the phone woke me up. I mumbled some sort of hello into the receiver. "Jerry." For once, I was caught off guard. "Who is this?" I asked, already suspecting the answer as I said the words. "It's me," he said. Of course it was. "Elvis, where are you?" Last I'd heard, he was going to be in Memphis through the holidays. "I'm in Dallas, Texas, changing planes. I should be out there pretty soon." Who's with you?" "Nobody," he said. He sounded proud of it. "You're at the Dallas airport by yourself?" "Yeah, and listen, Jerry, I don't want anybody to know where I am. It's important. Can you meet me at the airport?" I asked him what flight he'd be on. For all the traveling Elvis had done in his life, he had never had to worry about flight numbers and gate numbers and terminal numbers. We guys worked out the details. Elvis just got on a plane and assumed it would get him to where he was supposed to be. But here I was on the phone listening to Elvis rustle through his papers to figure out the flight number of his American Airlines connecting flight from Dallas to L.A. When I was sure I'd gotten the right numbers from him, I told him I'd bring my own car so as not to attract any extra attention. "Well, I think we can trust Sir Gerald," Elvis said. "Why don't you give him a call, but tell him I don't want anyone to know I'm here." Gerald Peters was Elvis's favorite limo driver in L.A., an older, dapper, exceedingly trustworthy Brit. He had never actually received a knighthood, but when Elvis discovered that he had been a driver for Winston Churchill, Elvis immediately titled him Sir Gerald. A few hours later, just after 2 a.m., I was in the back of a limo driven by Sir Gerald, and we drove right up to the American Airlines plane from Dallas. Back then you could make arrangements to pick up VIP passengers that way. I watched as passengers streamed off the plane, and I began to worry about what might have happened to an unattended Elvis since he made the phone call from Dallas. But after all the others were off, there he was at the top of the steps. I got out of the car and waved him over. As he approached, I saw he was holding a little cardboard box. "Hey, you okay?" "Yeah, thanks for coming out." "What's in the box?" "That's my luggage." Back then, a first-class passenger got a little container with a face cloth and a comb and a toothbrush inside. Not only was Elvis traveling by himself, he was traveling light. I also noticed that he had some angry-looking red welts on his neck and face. "What's the matter with your skin, E?" "I took some penicillin for a sore throat. I guess I'm having an allergic reaction. Maybe we can get a doctor to the house." "All right, I'll make the call. Sir Gerald, let's go." "Wait a minute, Jerry. I promised the stewardesses that I'd give them a ride home." He nodded over his shoulder, and I saw that we were being joined by a pair of stewardesses from the flight. Apparently Elvis's desire to travel secretly didn't stop him from charming the flight crew, and while I made arrangements for a doctor to meet us at the house on Hillcrest, we drove across town, dropping off the very impressed girls at their apartments. We finally got to Hillcrest, and a doctor I'd gotten through a referral service was waiting for us at the gate. We got inside, and the doc gave Elvis an examination and agreed that it looked like an allergic reaction. It was getting close to dawn. Elvis was already looking pretty tired, and the doctor gave him something to relieve the skin irritation that just about knocked him out. The doctor left, and Elvis went off to bed. I called Sandy to let her know what was going on, and as I hung up, the crazy, scary truth of my situation hit me hard. Elvis Presley was my responsibility. His wife didn't know where he was. His father didn't know where he was. The guys didn't know where he was. The colonel didn't know where he was. For the first time in 15 years, nobody close to Elvis knew where he was. Except me. I was tired, but I stayed awake, watching the morning sun light up the sky. Taking care of Elvis had brought on a surge of adrenaline, and while he slept, I stayed in the living room, trying to figure out the most sensible way to handle the situation. By Sunday afternoon, I still hadn't come to any firm conclusions, but Elvis was wide awake. Whatever had gotten him out of Memphis didn't seem to be bothering him now. He was in a great mood. We made some coffee and sat there, staring out at the home's spectacular view of the city. We caught up with each other and talked about Priscilla, Sandy, and little Lisa. We talked about which guys were doing a good job for him and who was getting into trouble. Eventually, he let me know why he'd left Graceland. "I'll tell you why I didn't want anybody to know where I was," he said. "It's because Daddy and Priscilla were complaining about the way I spend my money. The way I spend my own damn money. And they went and brought the fucking colonel into it, too. I wasn't going to sit around and listen to that." He had stormed out of the house in the past after various arguments, but this time he simply walked out of the house and left town. He'd gotten on the first commercial flight out of Memphis he could, which took him to Washington, D.C. He had checked into a hotel there, but then decided he'd be better off making his way to L.A. I'd learned later that Priscilla and Vernon had some reason to be upset. Over the last month or so, Elvis had gone on a spending spree amounting to tens of thousands of dollars, and there was no sign of him slowing down. The gold TCBs had only been the start. After the death threat in Las Vegas, he had become very concerned with personal protection and had spent thousands on new guns. At the beginning of December, he had completely bankrolled George Klein's wedding, flying all of us to Las Vegas for a weekend. At the end of that weekend, he decided to put a down payment on a house for Joe and Joni Esposito, and he bought several Mercedes as gifts, one of which went to Sandy and me. Elvis told me he was going to put a down payment on a house for me, too, but Joe talked him out of it, explaining that I wouldn't be able to make mortgage payments on my apprentice editor's salary. Elvis and I spent the whole day up at Hillcrest, just sitting around talking. He was very excited about all the adventures he had managed to pack into his solo trip so far, and wanted to relay all the details. In the wake of the death threat, Elvis had gone about qualifying for a Shelby County Deputy Sheriff badge, a credential that allowed him to carry a concealed weapon. But he explained that a little uppity mustache guy, steward on the flight to Dallas, wasn't going to let him bring his gun on the plane, even after Elvis showed him the new badge. After Elvis angrily left the plane, the pilot himself came running out to get him, apologized for the inconvenience, and insisted it would be all right by him for Elvis to have his registered firearm on board.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.
Since I had stopped working for Elvis, it had become harder for us to spend this kind of time together. But it felt easy and satisfying to be sitting with him again, sipping coffee and talking, friend to friend. It was getting close to sunset when he told me that his weekend trip wasn't over. "Jerry, I'm going back to Washington. Tonight. I need you to come with me." "Elvis, I've got a job. I have to be at work tomorrow." "I'll charter a Learjet to fly you back." If his spending habits were getting him into trouble, I didn't want him hiring a jet just for me. "Look, Elvis, a chartered plane won't get me back any faster than a commercial flight. There's no use in spending that kind of money." For the first time that day, his warm expression darkened. "All right, "I'll go by myself," he said. He sounded equal parts defiant rebel and pouting little boy. I still felt responsible for his safety, and I thought about him carrying his gun onto another plane, maybe one with a pilot who wasn't so understanding. There was a chance I'd lose the job at Paramount I'd worked so hard to get, but I decided I'd help get Elvis through the next part of his trip. "Well, listen, E, if I go with you, you have to let me make a call. People may think you're hurt or kidnapped. Your family's probably worried sick. Let me tell your dad and Priscilla you're okay, and let me have Sonny or Red come up and meet us in Washington so I can fly back." He agreed I should make the call, and said I should have Sonny come up and meet us. I phoned Graceland right away, and Sonny answered the phone. I explained to him what was going on, then took some time to explain to Vernon where Elvis was and where he was going, and that he should let Priscilla know that Elvis was all right. After that call, I had to snap into action to work out all the details for Elvis's return trip to D.C., lining up our airline tickets, making the pre-boarding arrangements, booking our hotel rooms, and hiring limos to get us to and from the airports. There was no way to do this without spending some more of Elvis's money. I charged most of it to his American Express card. A short while later, with Sir Gerald again at the wheel, we were driving back to LAX. It had occurred to me that we might need some cash during the course of the trip. I didn't have any. Not an unusual situation for me back then, and Elvis didn't have any either. All we had was his credit card and a checkbook that I'd found in his desk at Hillcrest. The ever-resourceful Sir Gerald spoke up and said that he knew someone at the Beverly Hilton Hotel who might honor a check for $500 on a Sunday night. So we made the stop there and succeeded in getting the money. Elvis handed it to me for safekeeping. We got to the airport and were the first to board our red-eye flight. As the rest of the passengers boarded, we noticed that there were an unusual number of soldiers on the plane. Guys coming home from Vietnam who had first stopped in L.A. and were now heading back east to their homes just in time for Christmas. Many passengers recognized Elvis, and he was cordial with everyone who said hello. Before the plane took off, one of the soldiers came up the aisle to stand next to Elvis and talk with him. He told Elvis what a big fan he was, and Elvis took an interest in the young guy, asking him where he was coming from and where he was heading. I saw that the two were having a very friendly conversation, and my attention drifted after a while. It was refocused when Elvis put a gentle elbow in my ribs. "Where's that money?" "What money?" I asked. But I'd seen enough of Elvis's gestures of generosity to suspect what was coming next. "The $500. "That's all we've got, Elvis." "You don't understand. This guy's just come home from the war. He's going home to see his family. I want him to have the money." The soldier got the $500, and I was suddenly in the strange situation of traveling across the country with Elvis Presley, absolutely penniless. Once the flight was in the air, Elvis struck up a conversation with the stewardess who was tending to us. From her he learned that there was a government VIP on the plane, U.S. Senator George Murphy of California. Elvis was very interested in meeting the senator and headed back to introduce himself. I looked back a couple of times to see that the two seemed engaged in a very serious conversation. When Elvis returned to his seat, I got another elbow. "Jerry, you think they have some stationery on this plane?" We called the stewardess over and got a hold of several sheets of airline stationery and a pen. And there, in the first-class cabin, Elvis Presley began to write a letter. This might have been the most surprising development of the trip so far. I'd certainly never seen Elvis write a letter before. He worked diligently for quite a while, and when he was finished, he handed me the pages. "Jerry, I just wrote a letter to President Nixon. Would you proofread it for me?" Here was a letter from the biggest star in the world to the leader of the free world being given to me, the guy who flunked first grade, for proofreading. But I was touched by how readily he trusted me with it. The pages weren't pretty. Elvis's penmanship was somewhere between a doctor's and a grade schooler's, but right away I was impressed with the tone of the writing. Elvis was being humble, respectful, and sincere, and was offering his services to the president to work as a kind of ambassador between the rock and roll subculture and the government. After describing the establishment that so many young people were finding fault with, Elvis had underlined a thought. "I call it America, and I love it." I felt a mix of feelings as I read that. I felt protective toward Elvis, and didn't want him to come across as a right-wing extremist, but I also knew where his heart was, and had always felt that the truest expression of his politics was in a pair of his records, If I Can Dream and In the Ghetto. And reading the letter, I could see that when he talked about loving America, it wasn't part of a political agenda. It was because he had lived the American dream and wanted desperately to be able to give something back to the land that had made his wonderful life possible. He didn't consider his years of army duty to have settled the debt. He was going straight to the highest authority in the country to try to find a way to use some of his power in a constructive way. He did want something in return. "First and foremost, I am an entertainer, but all I need is the federal credentials." Elvis was making a sincere offer of services, but if he was going to be of some use to the government, he wanted official recognition. He wanted a badge. To me, this didn't seem crazy or unusual. From the earliest period of Elvis's career, he had felt a strong kinship with the policemen who had protected him during concerts and public appearances, and greatly enjoyed hearing about their lives and their work. And it seemed that no matter how tough the cops were, they always enjoyed their connection to Elvis. At some point, he began asking if he could have credentials from the police departments he worked with, and began accumulating honorary badges. His badge collection became a passionate hobby of his. He'd show them off the way someone else might show off their prized coins or stamps. After the threat in Las Vegas, though, the honorary badges weren't quite as exciting or useful anymore. He wanted credentials that gave him a real working connection to the police forces he dealt with, and he wanted to be able to travel with the guns he felt he needed for personal safety. He, along with some of us guys, had received Shelby County Deputy Sheriff badges back in Memphis, and we had also been officially deputized in Palm Springs after proving ourselves capable on the police shooting range. I'd been with Elvis a month before when he had gotten a glimpse of the ultimate prize, a federal badge. Elvis had asked me to come along with him to a dinner at the renowned Beverly Hills restaurant Chasen's. The dinner had been set up by John O'Grady, a tough, gruff ex-LA narcotics cop. O'Grady had been referred to Elvis by his attorney, Ed the Hook Stratton, to work for him as a private detective, helping him get to the bottom of what turned out to be a baseless paternity suit against him. Elvis had no interest in dining in upscale hotspots, but he couldn't say no to O'Grady's invitation. The detective promised to introduce him to a fully credentialed federal undercover agent. That agent turned out to be Paul Frees, an unremarkable-looking guy who was well known as a cartoon voiceover artist. Frees had done undercover narcotics work for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the precursor to the DEA. Given his government work, it's interesting that one of his best-known voices was that of evil spy Boris Badenov from the Bullwinkle Show. With some encouragement from O'Grady, Frees showed Elvis his federal badge, and I saw my friend's eyes light up. He was going to have to figure out a way to get his own BNDD badge. And this letter was a brilliant way to make that badge a possibility. Elvis cited Senator Murphy in the body of the text and had him listed as a messenger. It would be delivered via Senator George Murphy. A couple of other things struck me about the letter. First, though I had long stopped being impressed that Elvis knew my name, I was a little surprised to see that he could spell my surname perfectly. He mentioned to the president that he was traveling with me. I was also amused when I read one of Elvis's final points, that he'd be glad to help his country as long as it is kept very private. I didn't see how anything around Elvis could stay private for long, especially a government credential. The letter ended with a request for a personal meeting with the president. When I finished reading the letter, I felt that these pages couldn't capture the spirit of Elvis any better. It was a work of warmth, sincerity, innocence, and skillful strategy that conveyed both a successful man's generosity and a little kid's desire for a special prize. Frankly, I didn't think we had a chance of getting into the White House. I'd read that with the Vietnam War effort in a state of turmoil, even senators were having a hard time meeting with the president. But I wasn't going to change a word of Elvis's heartfelt writing. Great letter, E. I think you should send it as is." By the time we landed in Washington and climbed into a limo, Elvis had changed his mind about delivering the letter. He didn't want to send it via the senator. He wanted to deliver it in person. I'd been up for 2 days and had been looking forward to a shower at the Washington Hotel. "Elvis, it's barely daylight. Shouldn't we check into the hotel first and clean up?" "Jerry, I want to get this to the White House." Of course, we headed to the White House, and I guess it hadn't really occurred to me how out of place we'd be in official Washington until our car pulled up to the Northwest Guard Gate at the White House and Elvis jumped out to deliver his letter. He had been wearing clothes that made perfect sense in any Elvis setting: a navy blue gabardine, karate-style 2-piece suit over a high-collared shirt with a topcoat draped over his shoulders, accessorized with a gold medallion, a thick gold belt, and a gold-handled walking stick. At Graceland or in L.A., this was simply Elvis dressed up. But as he strode purposefully toward the White House security guards, I feared he might be taken for some kind of gabardine invasion force. The guards certainly didn't appreciate being startled this way and went into a high alert mode. They wanted the car moved and the guy in the topcoat gone. I could see Elvis wasn't going to come this far to be turned away, and the situation had the possibility of turning ugly, so I ran out to do some diplomatic work. I began to calmly explain that this was Mr. Elvis Presley, and that he had simply written a letter to the president that he wished to deliver. The guards took another look at the security threat beside me, and all of a sudden understood who was in front of them. Happy to be of service, they took the letter and promised to get it to the president within the hour. We finally got over to the hotel and cleaned ourselves up, and I assumed Elvis and I would hang out until Sonny got there. It would be my job to keep him from getting too disappointed about the White House not calling. But Elvis had some other angles to work. He wanted his meeting with the president, but he had also done enough research to know that the deputy director of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs was a guy named John Finlater. Elvis was going to Finlater's office to make a direct request for the badge. "Sure, you stay here and wait for the president's call," he told me. "Here's the number at Finlater's office. Call right away when you hear something." And he left. I'd been reading stuff about some of the people that worked for Howard Hughes, how they'd be left in a hotel room waiting for some urgent, top-secret call that never came. I had visions of growing another beard for Elvis as I waited in vain for the phone to ring. But about a half hour later, just as I was thinking about keeping my strength up with a room service order, the phone did ring. It was the White House. "Mr. Schilling, this is Eagle Krogh of the White House staff. The president has read Mr. Presley's letter and would like to meet with him in 30 minutes. I explained that Mr. Presley wasn't there at the moment, but that I'd get in touch with him and relay the message. I dialed John Finlater's office number as quickly as I could. "Hello, is Mr. Elvis Presley there? Who is this?" I explained my connection, and in a moment, Elvis was on the line. He sounded down. "I'm not doing any good here, Jerry. Can't get the badge. What's going on?" I told him that the president wanted to see him in 25 minutes and counting. Knowing how badly he wanted this meeting and the badge, the easiest thing would have been for him to make a beeline to the White House by himself, but he wanted me to come with him. "Jerry, you stand out in front of the hotel. We'll swing by and you jump in." I got down in front of the place just in time to see Sonny get out of his cab from the airport and grab his bags. "Sonny," I shouted, "leave your bags with the bellman. We're going to the White House." With perfect movie timing, Elvis's limo pulled up right then, and Sonny and I jumped in. This time the gate guards were prepared for us, and we made a smooth entrance to the White House grounds. We were met by Eagle Bud Krogh, a friendly, professional-looking guy who had an aura of can-do competence about him. He had us sit in his office for a moment so that he could put us through an official pre-presidential meeting interrogation, making clear exactly what our purpose was in requesting the meeting with the president. Elvis got comfortable on the couch in Krogh's office and went over some of the same points he'd made in his letter. Krogh had read the letter, and he and Elvis discussed some of the ways he might help the administration deliver an anti-drug message to kids and teenagers. The meeting didn't last too long, and ended with Krogh telling us that White House Chief of Staff Bob Haldeman had approved the meeting of Mr. Presley and President Nixon. There was just one complication. Because of Secret Service precautions, Only Elvis would meet the president. Sonny and I would have to wait for him in Krog's office. Krog and a very contented-looking Elvis got up to head to the meeting. And I couldn't believe that what had started out as a crazy idea on some American Airlines stationery was now going to end in the Oval Office. Sonny and I hung out with a young White House staffer who I seem to remember had just started dating Nixon's younger daughter. We talked about some of the complications of a romance like that, and we talked a little bit about our experiences working with Elvis. After a while, the phone in the office rang, and the staffer went to answer it. He came back with a very surprised look on his face. The president wants to meet Mr. Presley's friends." Elvis had gotten his meeting, and the leader of the free world was, understandably, on a rigidly controlled time schedule, but Elvis was thoughtful enough to ask if Sonny and I could come join him, and he and the president had gotten along well enough that the president said yes. We were led down the hall to the Oval Office, and I remember thinking, I'm the guy who wanted to be a history teacher, and now I'm about to step into a room where history is written almost every day. I'm about to step through a door into the office of the most powerful man in the world. But when we got to that door, it was opened by maybe the second most powerful man in the world, Elvis. "Come on in, guys," he said. "Meet the president." I don't think he'd ever been in a better mood. I stepped in and froze for a moment. My first thought, admittedly not a profound one, was, wow, the Oval Office is really an oval. Elvis may have thought I was scared to come further in, so he pushed me a little and started laughing. "It's okay, Jerry. You don't have to be afraid." President Nixon was by his desk at the far end of the oval, signing something, and he moved to welcome us as we stepped forward. After we shook hands, the president gave me a light punch in the arm. "You've got a couple of big ones here, Elvis," he said. "You boys play football?" I hadn't been a fan of Nixon's, and in person he seemed as uncomfortable as he looked in photos and on television, but there was something open and, surprisingly, honest about him, too. He really had been moved by Elvis's letter, and seemed genuinely pleased to have us all there for a visit. We were probably the most unusually dressed visitors he had had in some time. Along with Elvis in his gabardine, Sonny was wearing a dark suit fit for a Hollywood nightclub, and I was in a leather jacket. But that didn't seem to faze the president a bit. So we talked some football with him, handicapping the college season. There was a White House photographer in the room, and we all had our pictures taken with the president. As the photos were snapped, I couldn't stop thinking about just how far Elvis had taken me in all our years and all our travels, from Guthrie Park to the White House. By the end of our audience with the president, he and Elvis were talking like old friends and exchanging thoughts on how Elvis's offer of service might be put into action. Here were two great men, but great men who had found their success to be extremely complicated, and as different as they were, I think there was a mutual understanding between them. From some of their conversation, it also became evident to me that President Nixon had overridden Deputy Director Finlater. Elvis was going to get his badge. As our time in the Oval Office came to an end, the president made what was probably the customary gesture of goodwill for visitors. He gave us each a pair of presidential cufflinks. To Sonny and me, these were as good as our own badge, and we thanked the president. But Elvis was thinking that we shouldn't go back to our families empty-handed. "You know, sir, these men have wives," he said. "Of course," said the president. "Let's see what we can find for the ladies." The president went to his desk at the end of the room and pulled open a drawer. Elvis stood right at his side, and when the president began rummaging through the drawer for more gifts, Elvis stuck his hands in and rummaged right along with him. By the time they were done, they'd come up with gold pins bearing the presidential seal, a perfect gift for Priscilla, Sandy, and Sonny's wife, Judy. "Thanks for coming by, fellas," said the president as we moved through a final round of handshakes. We all thanked him, then exited the Oval Office, guided again by Bud Krog. Sonny and I were awestruck by what had just happened. The lesson for me was to never doubt what my friend Elvis could accomplish. He was beaming, extremely satisfied with the way things had worked out, but I had the feeling he wasn't going to leave the White House until he had his promised badge and his accompanying credentials in hand. When Bud suggested that we could have lunch in the White House mess hall, Elvis quickly took him up on the offer. On the way to lunch, Crow gave us a private White House tour. We started in the Roosevelt Room across from the Oval Office, which featured a striking portrait of Teddy Roosevelt in his Rough Rider uniform, and then down hallways past all kinds of offices. Apparently word was out that Elvis was in the building because I think every secretary on duty came to their door to get a look at him. One even ran up and gave him a kiss. What visiting head of state would get that reaction? We made our way to the basement of the West Wing, past some stunned special duty police officers and some Secret Service agents trying not to look stunned. Elvis hadn't been too impressed with the plates, portraits, and White House trivia Bud pointed out along the way, but he was very excited when Bud showed us the door that led to the actual Situation Room, where global crises of all sorts were regularly taken care of. "No fighting in the war room," Elvis said, referring to a favorite moment from Dr. Strangelove. We went down a few more basement hallways to get to our lunch destination. The White House mess was officially run by the Navy and had the look of a grand dining room, dark wood paneling, heavy dark wood tables and chairs, and a thick carpet on the floor. Just the kind of formal place that usually made Elvis uncomfortable. But this day he didn't mind the formal setting or the attention he drew. We took a table right in the middle of the dining area and saw turning heads and amazed stares from all over the room. Princes, presidents, and power players of all kinds walked into that room every day, but an Elvis Presley sighting was obviously a bigger deal than that. We had our lunch, and afterwards, back at Krog's office, Elvis got his BNDD badge and his credentials, appointing him a special assistant. He was happy that he'd gotten what he was after, but I could see he was also quite sincere about trying to do something positive with his position. After we left the White House, we drove straight to the airport to catch our respective flights. I wanted to catch the first flight back to L.A. to make it to work on Tuesday, if Paramount still had me on the payroll. As we drove along, Elvis made it pretty clear that he wanted one other thing out of this weekend. He wanted me back, working full-time for him. Elvis didn't ever have to put himself in the position of pitching someone a job with him, but I think he really liked the way I'd handled his escape to L.A. and our White House adventure. I had passed some kind of a deep loyalty test that he hadn't even realized he'd been putting me through, and he knew I wanted work that felt like a career, work that made use of my own abilities. So he pitched me. "Jerry, how'd you feel about being my personal public relations man?" "I don't know, E. What would that entail?" "Well, I was talking with GK, and he had an idea about helping to get my records to sell. RCA doesn't give them enough push, so George said maybe I could use somebody like you as a personal PR man, have you meet with radio program directors, make sure they get the records, set up some interviews, all that type of stuff. What do you think?" If it were just between Elvis and me, I thought it sounded great. But there was somebody else to consider. "Elvis, I'd love that job, but I don't think the Colonel would let it happen." You'd be interested, though?" "It'd be a great job, Elvis." We left it at that. I made it back to L.A., where I discovered I was still employed at Paramount. A couple of weeks later, though, when I got home from work, Sandy handed me a large package from Memphis. I opened it to find stacks of hundreds of shiny red business cards, lettered in black with my name and a new title, Jerry Schilling, Personal Public Relations to Elvis Presley. I had every reason to believe that once the Colonel heard about this, these cards would be a waste of paper. But if Elvis was working this hard to get me back, what exactly was I doing splicing German Coke commercials out of Paramount features? I made up my mind. Whether the new title held or not, I was heading back to Memphis. Chapter 11. Promised Land Callin'. In January 1971, I was sitting in Ellis Auditorium, just like I did back in 1956, watching Elvis Presley headline. Except this time, Elvis wasn't sharing the bill with country and western stars, but with a cancer researcher, a civil rights activist, a highly decorated Army captain, and from the Nixon White House, Press Secretary Ron Ziegler. Elvis had been named one of the top 10 outstanding young Americans by the National Junior Chambers of Commerce, the JCs, an award that over the years had gone to such notables as Orson Welles, Jesse Jackson, Leonard Bernstein, Ted Kennedy, Howard Hughes, and Richard Nixon. As one of those outstanding Americans, he was required to make a speech. For all the stages he'd been on and for all the press conferences he'd handled, he had never appeared anywhere as a public speaker, and was incredibly nervous about doing so at this event. But when Elvis got up to accept his award, he delivered a humbly eloquent speech that, in a few brief lines, managed to say everything about how he saw himself. I could hear the nervousness. His voice was soft and his delivery halting, but his message still rang out in that auditorium. When I was a child, ladies and gentlemen, I was a dreamer. I read comic books and I was the hero of the comic book. I saw movies and I was the hero in the movie. So every dream I ever dreamed has come true 100 times. He took a moment to graciously recognize the achievements of the other nominees, then finished with some lines from a favorite song of his childhood, one he knew best as a 1955 hit record for R&B singer Roy Hamilton, that in this context sounded simple and insightful. Without a song, the day would never end. Without a song, a man ain't got no friend. Without a song, the road would never bend. Without a song. So I keep singing a song. Good night. Thank you. Yes, I was back with Elvis and back with the guys, which at this point included Red and Sonny, Joe Esposito, Marty Lacker, Charlie Hodge, Billy Smith, and Dick Grobe, a former Palm Springs policeman now assisting with Elvis security. It felt good to be back in that circle, not having to worry about jetting back to L.A. to punch a time clock every Monday morning. As much as I had enjoyed my editing work, I had been watching Elvis's career pick up momentum and excitement, and if he was willing to look for ways to give me more to do, it seemed an easy call to step away from the Moviola editing machines and get back with him. My beautiful wife was, again, completely supportive of the career change, which turned out to be not quite what Elvis had pitched. Just as I had suspected, the Colonel, in his indirect, non-confrontational, but absolutely final manner, had shot down any chance that I be working as an independent personal record promoter for Elvis. No matter how ready I was for a promotion, the Colonel was not going to let me get between him and RCA. That was disappointing to me, but I understood that the Colonel was doing his job as a manager. The circle of guys had been particularly tight lately. Elvis's interest in badges and credentials had spread to the rest of us, and we'd all done the required work to earn official Palm Springs police badges and Memphis deputy sheriff badges, taking all the required courses and written exams for both, and proving our abilities on the respective firing ranges. We'd also all been together for George Klein's wedding in Las Vegas and for Sonny West's wedding in Memphis. Elvis was the best man at both. The JC's award meant a great deal to Elvis. It honored him as an entertainer, but it also recognized his years of often unheralded generosity of time and money to so many charities. I think this humanitarian aspect of the award made it more meaningful to Elvis than any musical award he ever received. A gold record or even a Grammy was a win that satisfied his competitive spirit, but to be honored as a person of substance and good works was what he'd always been after. He actually carried that JC's award around with him for years, proudly showing it off, sort of the way he'd carried my gift gun around years before, though the gun couldn't exactly be considered a symbol of humanitarianism. It was a little strange that Elvis was now being honored by the sort of people who, years before, had been afraid of him, even disgusted by him. Although he'd been nominated for the JC's honor by former Memphis sheriff and future Shelby County Mayor Bill Morris, one of the very few local politicians who had always approached Elvis as a friend rather than a threat. Elvis had reached a point where both the politicians and the good old boys appreciated him. In light of that fact, I found it a little curious that our recent trip to the White House had managed to stay secret. Sandy and I sat at a small table with Mr. Ziegler at a dinner Elvis hosted at the Four Flames restaurant before the Ellis event, and the press secretary didn't say a word about it. The biggest summit meeting between the worlds of politics and rock and roll wouldn't be reported on at all until it turned up in a Washington Post column almost a full year after it happened. And though the government never put Elvis to any use as an agent, a representative of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs would call him every 6 months to make sure that he still had the federal badge in his possession. Elvis had once been seen as a dangerous rebel, and was now a respected, if very flashily dressed, member of the establishment. But a lot of what was at the core of Elvis hadn't changed so much. I got to see that as Sandy and I walked with him into a J.C.'s luncheon at the Rivermount Hotel before the award ceremony. One of the first guests Elvis recognized was Marion Keisker, who had served for years as Sam Phillips's right-hand woman at Sun Studios. It was Marion who had first met with Elvis at Sun, and she gave him some very important early encouragement. Marion had left Sun in 1957 to join the Air Force, and she was in full dress uniform at the Rivermount event. Elvis hadn't seen her in more than 10 years, but when he spotted her on the way into the luncheon, his eyes lit up, and he looked like the thrilled kid he must have been after many of those Sun sessions. When he turned to Sandy and me to introduce Marion, he explained who she was by simply saying, "This woman was there when it all started." By the end of January, Elvis was back in Las Vegas, beginning another month-long run at the International Hotel, the first engagement of several, during a year in which Elvis would also continue to record and tour. I quickly discovered that even though the business cards Elvis had printed up for me weren't going to get used, I did have some new responsibilities. Elvis liked to take the stage the way a prizefighter steps into the boxing ring, physically pumped and with a single-minded intensity. Part of what helped him do this was his timing before a show. He didn't like to be at a venue more than 15 minutes before he was scheduled to go on. He sometimes enjoyed socializing after a show, but never before. Once he was in his stage wardrobe, he wanted to stay strictly focused on the performance at hand. Putting on those clothes was the equivalent of the fighter getting his hands wrapped and his gloves on just before the fight. And those clothes had been designed to hold up throughout a fighter's workout. After his return to live performance, Elvis had quickly discovered that he couldn't move as freely and energetically as he wanted to wearing shirts and pants. Beginning with his second run at the International, he began wearing karate-influenced one-piece jumpsuits created by designer Bill Ballou. To get him in a state of maximum physical and mental readiness, he and I had worked out a move that was a cross between a karate exercise and some old-fashioned Indian wrestling. Just moments before he took the stage, he and I would stand sideways, facing each other, arms locked and front legs pushed against each other's. And we'd try to pull each other off balance, slowly applying more force until we were pulling as hard as we could. We'd build up the intensity, as behind a closed curtain the band played its "Thus Spake Zarathustra" intro. The curtain would sweep open, and just as it got to the place where we were standing, the music would shift into Elvis's powerful vamp, and he'd break away and storm out on stage, pumped up like a weightlifter who's just done his top bench press. There were some nights when we pulled at each other so hard I thought he might pull me out on stage with him, and frankly, the music and our move got my adrenaline so pumped up that I felt like I was ready to do the show too. Along the same lines, Elvis began to use me as what would today be called a personal trainer. His weight had been up and down over the years. His diet and the hours he kept had always made it easy to pick up pounds, while his metabolism, sometimes kicked along with diet pills, had made it easy to get the weight off. Now, at 36, Elvis knew he didn't have the same frame he'd had when he was 18. Whoever does? It was more of a battle to keep the pounds off, but it was a battle he was winning. He was still a very physically active performer, and his performance schedule, 2 shows a night, 7 days a week, kept him strong and lean. But he also wanted to develop an exercise regimen to keep him in top shape. So I became his exercise partner. In so many other areas, when Elvis said he wanted to do something, he did it in a big way, ignoring limits and pushing further than anyone thought possible. That wasn't quite his approach to exercise. For all his success, Elvis had a fierce competitive streak, but he generally liked to compete at things he knew he was good at. Exercise presented two problems. First, by nature, it wasn't competition. And second, Elvis just wasn't a very good exerciser. We were supposed to get in a good session before the first show each night, so every day after I heard that he was awake and had ordered his breakfast, usually in the late afternoon, I'd go up to his suite. Elvis started his days slowly and quietly. You didn't push him to do anything before he'd had some food and coffee. So once he'd had his meal and the time seemed right, I'd ask if he was ready for a workout. More often than not, the answer was no, he wasn't ready. Or he'd tell me flat out that he wasn't going to exercise that day, he didn't have time. I'd sit with him a while to talk and sometimes take one more try at it. "You sure you don't want to exercise, E?" The look in his eyes when he said, "Are you kidding?" meant that the discussion was over. Sometimes I'd go ahead and do my own workout in my room. I think I may have done some pioneering work, turning desks and chairs into personal gym equipment. Then I'd go about my day, helping the guys take care of whatever needed to be taken care of before a performance. Finally, I'd change out of my casual clothes and get cleaned up and dressed for the night. I'd go down to the hotel restaurant and hang out with Joe Esposito, Dr. Nick, who now traveled with us as Elvis's personal physician, promoter Tom Hewlett, and Joe Gersio, the fast-talking, fast-witted music director for Elvis's band. Many times we'd be seated, with our food ordered and on the way, when I'd get a call from Charlie Hodge upstairs. "Elvis wants to exercise." I'd go up to his room, often to find that even though I was in my evening clothes, Elvis was still in his pajamas. I'd try to give him the best workout I could for a trainer in British designer jeans and leather boots. I'd put on some music and we'd run in place. I'd do some sit-ups with him holding my legs, and then he'd do sit-ups with me holding his legs. But it seemed that whenever it was his turn to do sit-ups, he'd always come up with just the right comment to get me laughing and make me lose count. And if I lost count, then he started laughing. The truth was, he could do karate all day long, but he couldn't get through our exercise routine fast enough. There was no competition to it, except that I could do more sit-ups than him, and he didn't like that at all. So by the end of our sessions, he'd still be cool and calm in his pajamas, while I'd have sweated through my dress clothes. The half-hearted workouts didn't diminish in any way what he could do on stage at the time, and I never got tired of watching him from the wings. And to his credit, he never quite gave up on our fitness program. It became fairly predictable that each night, just as I sat down to dinner, I'd get the call, "Elvis wants to exercise." Elvis would often stay in town a few days after a Las Vegas run, sort of waiting out his fans, before he'd go out and see some of the other shows on the Strip. Sammy Davis Jr., Tom Jones, Fats Domino, and Ann Margaret were particular favorites. In the right mood, he'd jump on stage to join Tom in a song or two, and I remember him doing a Valentino-style slide across the stage on his knees to make a surprise entrance during one of Ann Margaret's shows. Ann and Elvis were both married now, but remained very close friends. And one of my fondest Vegas memories is a night when Elvis was bringing Sammy back to his suite after a show. He and Priscilla, Sammy and his wife Altovise, and I were making our way through the lobby when from the lounge we heard some unmistakable guitar riffs. Elvis looked at Sammy. Sammy smiled. Elvis said, "Let's go." The five of us strolled into a nearly empty lounge. This must have been a final 3 a.m. show, and saw Chuck Berry up on stage, finishing a tune. We got into a booth right up front. Chuck was extremely happy to have Elvis and Sammy in the room and started addressing them directly between songs. "Hey, Elvis, remember when you were number one with All Shook Up and I was trying to catch you with this one?" he said, hitting the opening riff to School Day. Elvis loved it. When he was watching a show he enjoyed in a comfortable setting, he was not a quiet audience, and this night he was hollering all kinds of encouragement to Chuck. He also had a great camaraderie with Sammy, an easy friendship that grew from their respect of each other's music and talents. It was Chuck up on the lounge stage, but the real show was in the great, loud interaction between him and Elvis and Sammy. Priscilla and Altovise were also enjoying the show, but had a little more ladylike poise. "Play Promised Land, Chuck," Elvis shouted out at one point, and Chuck went right into the tune. The story of a poor Southern boy making his way to California that was one of Elvis's favorites. In 1974, Elvis would reach the top 20 with his own version of the tune. Elvis and Sammy started singing along from the booth, shouting out "Yes!" as Chuck name-checked his way through Norfolk, Charlotte, Atlanta, and Birmingham. When Chuck got to the line about buying a through train ticket so that he could be riding across Mississippi clean, Elvis and Sammy cracked up, both of them understanding completely why Chuck or any black person wouldn't have wanted to make any stops within those state lines back in the 1950s. It was another of those reality check moments for me. I was sitting in a Las Vegas booth with Elvis and Sammy Davis, watching Chuck Berry do a private concert for us. That's a good night out. The showbiz personality that Elvis became closest with was Tom Jones, who he considered a trusted friend. They had crossed paths several times through the 60s and had hit it off with each other right away, and eventually spent some time together in Hawaii. When they were both in Las Vegas, they enjoyed hanging out and partying after each other's shows, and I can vividly remember Tom's stunned but game reaction the first time Elvis offered to put on a karate demonstration for him up in his suite. Tom had come several times to see Elvis at the International, and one night after Elvis's run was done, Elvis, Priscilla, and some of us guys went to see Tom's show at the Stardust. We went ahead and worked out the usual arrangements for a visit like this with the Stardust maitre d'. Elvis and our group would be seated after the lights went down and escorted to the backstage dressing room before the end of the show to avoid being a distraction. But Elvis was still in the habit of drinking bottle after bottle of mountain spring water, and in the middle of Tom's show, he had to go to the bathroom. I got up to go with him. At this time, Elvis often carried a cane with him, both for its looks and its potential as an emergency weapon. But his best defensive move was speed. Elvis had learned to do a very fast power walk through the lobbies and casinos and showrooms just to avoid being stopped, and I'd do what I could to keep up with him. On our way back from the bathroom, we were walking even faster than we had before. We passed a little lounge where a cover band, an Irish show band, was playing. Their lead singer was a big, burly guy who happened to be in the middle of singing an Elvis Presley tune. The big guy wasn't bad, but he was overdoing the Elvis vibrato just a bit. Without breaking stride, Elvis said, "Jerry, wait here," and stormed into the lounge. He walked right up on stage, hoisted his cane like he was going to clobber this guy, and said, "If you're going to do it right." He gave the crowd in the lounge a great big wink, hopped off the stage, and zoomed right out of there. But the big singer didn't see the wink. He had been so startled that he had fallen over on stage. We were cracking up about it all the way back to our table. But no sooner did I get settled in to see the rest of Tom's show than Elvis leaned over to tell me, "Jerry, go back and invite that guy and his band to come up to the suite after the show." Elvis loved a laugh, but he didn't want to be the superstar bully who had left some poor, hard-working lounge musician feeling humiliated. I delivered the message to the guy, and I was up in Elvis's suite that night when the singer showed up. He mingled with the rest of us, and Elvis talked with him for a while, and from the huge grin on the big guy's face, you could tell how much it meant to him to be where he was. In the space of a few hours, he had gone from having an on-stage nightmare come true to having the night of his life up in Elvis's suite. In the spring and early summer of 1971, Elvis had that rarest of luxuries, some time off. He made use of that time to further develop a couple of his passionate pursuits. In Memphis, he began to receive karate instructions from Master Kong Ree, a slight, quiet martial arts master with a studio near Graceland. Elvis liked the no-frills setting of the studio, along with the fact that Master Ree seemed uninterested in his new student's fame outside the studio. Pretty soon, Elvis had some of us guys working out there while we were in Memphis. In Los Angeles, I had already begun studies with Ed Parker. Master Ree came up with the idea of fitting each of us with a nickname that somehow reflected our approach to the discipline. I was Master Cougar, Red was Mr. Dragon, Sonny was Mr. Eagle, and Charlie was Mr. Cobra. Elvis, of course, was Mr. Tiger. Priscilla began working with Master Ree, too, and though I'm not sure she received a nickname, she ended up with a lightning-fast reverse kick that put us all to shame. On the domestic front, Priscilla had spent months renovating and redecorating what she hoped would be her and Elvis's longtime home in Los Angeles, a large house on Montevale Drive, formerly owned by director Blake Edwards, that offered much more privacy than the Hillcrest house. There were still a lot of boys' weekends in Palm Springs, but in his own way, I know that Elvis still wanted to think of himself as a devoted family man. And whatever strains his schedule and his actions might have put on his relationship with Priscilla, it was always clear that he still loved being a father. I remember getting off a private plane with Elvis at Santa Monica Airport when Priscilla had brought Lisa Marie to meet him at the airport. We came down the steps of the plane, and Lisa broke free and just came running to her dad as fast as her little legs would carry her. She had tears in her eyes. She was so happy to see him. And he scooped her up and held her like he didn't need anything else in the world. You couldn't doubt for a second that she adored him and he adored her. By the end of 1971, the domestic situations for all of us were harder to maintain. Elvis began touring again, and for the better part of the next year I was on the road with him, hitting everything from a Kentucky State Fair to New York City's Madison Square Garden. The road can be awfully punishing. It takes a toll physically and psychologically. On a tour, it doesn't take long before you're disconnected from anything resembling the real world, and you're just living from city to city. You don't eat right and you don't sleep right. You lose track of what time of day it is, what time of year it is, what part of the map you're on. Still, I loved being on the road with Elvis Presley. Working with Elvis, I'd eventually found that sound stages and studio lots could become pretty boring places, but concert tours never felt that way. I loved getting on the planes, smelling the jet fuel and hearing the roar of the engines. I loved hopping into limos with police lights around us as we drove to and from an airport. I loved being in the wings to watch a show. And I loved the adrenaline of running off the stage with Elvis at the end of a show, getting back into the limo and trying to beat the rush of fans. Hearing Ronnie Tutt's drums rumble at the end of the show and Al Dvoran's famous "Elvis has left the building" announcement. I loved using the back entrances to the hotels, the secret elevators. I loved hanging out in the hotel rooms with the guys and the band, watching Elvis laugh and entertain and sometimes even do a little impromptu singing. As undisciplined as Elvis may have been with something like a checkbook or sit-ups, he was masterful at putting together and maintaining a smooth-running touring operation. And he took a great deal of pride in his organization. I think it was on tour that I finally realized the true value of what we guys did for Elvis. He never hired an outside accountant or road manager or security chief. He had us to take care of all that. Everybody had a job to do, from Red West handling security to Lamar Fike running the stage lights. When people wondered about the value of the Memphis Mafia, Elvis used to say, "You don't think these guys are important? I'm a multi-million-dollar operation and I can't do this on my own." On the road, we developed an us-against-the-world camaraderie. And though a good portion of the world loved Elvis, we never let our guard down. One of our prime responsibilities was to make it possible for him to relax and be the entertainer he wanted to be. Because I was an ex-football guy, I was sometimes in the position of a bodyguard for Elvis. I worried about that at first. That wasn't the job I'd stepped away from my own career for. But I knew it was part of the job. It was for all of us. And on tour, I felt especially protective of Elvis. It felt good to take care of him, and to know that he felt more secure having me around. I didn't learn much about the country, or get a feel for any new places I was visiting. One city had the same trash cans around the back entrance of a hotel as the next. But just as I had on those film sets, I tried to learn as much about the process and mechanics around me as I could. I'd watch how the gear got moved and set up and see how the sound equipment was handled. There was as much craft in that work as there was in what was going to be presented on stage, and I felt I was getting another great education watching it all happen. With everybody doing their part, we got our city-to-city hops down to a science. The colonel would fly to a city with his staff and maybe one Elvis guy, usually Sonny West, the night before a show. The colonel would make sure that all the promotions and preparations were being properly handled, while Sonny would work on security at the hotel and inside venue, figuring out the best entrances and exits, and making sure that access to Elvis's dressing room could be controlled. Right after a show, Elvis would be ready to head to that next city. Given his sleep habits and the rush of adrenaline after a show, it made more sense for him to get to the next city late at night than to try to get him up for travel the next morning. When Al said, "Elvis has left the building," he was telling the truth. We were already on the way to the airport. This meant that there was never much of a backstage scene with Elvis on the road. 6 Cokes and 6 Pepsis was as elaborate as our backstage ever got, and sometimes that didn't even get touched. But when Elvis and a couple of us were invited to meet Johnny Carson after one of his Vegas stand-up appearances, we discovered an even tamer backstage scene. Elvis was a huge fan of Johnny's and wouldn't leave for screenings at the Memphian until after Johnny's monologue was over, so he was very excited to meet him. We didn't quite expect a raging Rat Pack-style party in Johnny's dressing room, but what we found was Johnny sitting by himself on a couch with a glass of water and a legal pad on a table in front of him. We sat with him a while, made small talk, and left. Johnny hadn't left the building, but his backstage was quieter than ours. After a show, we flew with Elvis on his chartered plane, and when we got to the next town, no matter what time of night it was or what the weather conditions were, the colonel would be waiting for us at the bottom of the steps off the plane, ready to brief Elvis. Looking back, I think the colonel was as energized by the touring as Elvis was. I've never seen a big act's manager do as much hands-on work with so much dedication. The band followed later that night or the next morning on another plane. One of 2 sound systems would have been trucked in, while the second was sent ahead to an upcoming destination. The big details of security and travel plans had to be taken care of, but the small ones were important too. Elvis's room would be prepared by some of the newer guys who would eventually include Dr. Nick's son, Dean Nicopolis, Vernon's stepsons, Rick and David Stanley, and Al Strata, a private security guard who worked at Elvis's L.A. homes before Elvis made him a part of his personal staff. Room preparation on the road was a process that still included blacking out the windows with aluminum foil and making sure that the AC could keep the suite just shy of freezing cold. The next day, the colonel would head off to the next city, Elvis would do his show, and the whole routine would repeat itself. There was just one big problem with life on the road, and that was that we all had lives off the road too, and those lives suffered. Inside the bubble of our traveling organization, things could feel balanced and right, but outside that bubble, we were, for the most part, absent husbands and family members. As much as Elvis wanted to think of himself as a family man, he and Priscilla had begun to pull apart. In a strange way, Elvis was a one-woman man. It's just that he had a number of those one women. Priscilla was the most important woman in his life, but he felt he could be loyal to more than one person at a time, admittedly not a very traditional view of marital fidelity. In the years I knew him, he was never particularly interested in meaningless groupie encounters. He had a real romantic streak, and he wanted companionship, someone to talk with, read with, and relax with. When he was with Priscilla, he had all that. But Priscilla, now the devoted mother of a small child, couldn't travel as freely as she once had. And since Elvis couldn't always be with Priscilla, he developed friendships and relationships with women who would be part of his life for weeks, months, or even years sometimes. He was living a one-of-a-kind life, so maybe ordinary rules of romance and commitment didn't apply to him. But that certainly wasn't fair to Priscilla. She had been a little girl when she first stepped into Elvis's world, but now she was becoming a stronger, more aware, more independent woman, and she wasn't living anything close to the kind of life she wanted with Elvis. Something had to give. In February of 1972, Elvis finished up an engagement at a familiar showroom with a new name. The Las Vegas International was now the Las Vegas Hilton. Priscilla was there for closing night, and between Elvis's two final shows, she and he spent a long time in his dressing room together. When they were done talking, Elvis asked me to walk Priscilla back up to his suite. I got her to the elevator and up to the room, and I don't think we talked much on the way. Before I left her in the room, I asked if there was anything I could get for her. She turned, looked at me a moment, and said quietly, "Jerry, you've always been a good friend." Now, this was unusual, as close as we'd become over the years, and for as much time as we'd spent together with Elvis and Sandy, Priscilla didn't normally say things like that. And I couldn't think of anything to answer her with. I just smiled, said goodnight, and left. But I knew something felt very different. It all came out the next night. She was leaving him. Elvis stayed in Vegas for a while after the Hilton shows. It was obvious that he was hurt and angry, with himself as much as with Priscilla, and it was also pretty clear that he didn't want to talk about his problems much. He stayed up in his suite a few days, and each night one of the guys would be with him. One night it was just me sitting with Elvis up there. I casually asked if he was in the mood to go downstairs and play blackjack, knowing full well that the answer would be no. Elvis wasn't a big gambler to begin with, and in this situation I thought he'd be in no mood to be around people. But he surprised me. "Yeah, let's hit those tables," he said. We changed our clothes and went downstairs to the casino. We started playing and, of course, began to draw some attention. The casino put the usual red ropes around us, but after a while I started thinking we should move along before we drew a real crowd. We headed back to the hotel lounge, which was bigger than most showrooms at the time, and when we saw that the Righteous Brothers were up on stage there, we decided to hang out at a small casino bar just outside the lounge entrance. Elvis and I basically were not drinkers, and I think we probably intended to order one cocktail and nurse it for the night. But as people noticed Elvis, they'd come over and say hello and offer to buy us a drink. Norm Crosby was one of the first well-wishers who wanted to pay for a round, and to be polite, we said yes. The drink went down easy, and our place at the bar started to feel very comfortable. Elvis didn't feel like he was in a spotlight, and it felt normal and natural to be hanging out to have a drink. The people who stopped by didn't overreact either. They'd stop, say hello, buy us another drink, talk for a moment, then move on. We must have had 4 or 5 drinks apiece that way. We drank clear through the Righteous Brothers set and then some. Finally, one of the brothers himself, Bill Medley, showed up with his girlfriend, Darlene Love of the Blossoms, the group that had backed Elvis in the '68 TV special. We had a drink with them, and those went down even easier. By 3 a.m., we were by ourselves again at the bar, and I realized that it was time for me to be the responsible party. "E, we better get out of here." It took a little extra work to get the words out. "Yeah, okay. That's about all the damage we can do here." He was having a little trouble enunciating, too. We made our way across the casino floor and out the front doors. I went into responsible party mode, keeping an eye on Elvis while I hailed a cab for us. We flopped into the back seat of the first one that pulled up. "Hilton Hotel, please," I said to the driver. He turned and gave Elvis and me a very curious look. "Sir?" he said. "Yeah," said Elvis. "You're at the Hilton Hotel." Yes, we were. We were at the Hilton Hotel, and we were drunk enough not to know it. We laughed our way back in and up to our rooms, and then, over the next day, fought off a pair of monster hangovers. Joe Esposito and I were with Elvis at the RCA Hollywood Studios, where he had just spent an all-night recording session with Felton Jarvis and most of his Vegas band. It was Elvis's custom to okay a preliminary mix in a listening room, and it wasn't uncommon to be in the room when Elvis was doing this kind of listening. But this night, he made a point of having Joe and me listen to one particular new track with him. He knew there was something about this one that we could all relate to in a stronger than usual way. The song he was listening to was one that Red had written for him, a song called Separate Ways. While Elvis had a good time performing his rockers, he was also drawn to emotional storytelling ballads. Red had come up with this song about a disintegrating marriage well before any of us knew the full extent of the troubles between Elvis and Priscilla. But now Elvis, with Red's words, seemed to be singing a piece of heartbroken autobiography. Love has slipped away, left us only friends. We almost seem like strangers. There was even a verse about a child trying to make sense of her parents' divorce, and a chorus that said there was nothing left to do but head out in separate ways and hope that a new love might be found somewhere in the future. Elvis could sing a ballad with as much power as he used on the rockers, but on this track there was something subdued in his voice. You could hear how sorry this singer was to be singing the words of this song. The track hit home with Joe and with me. Hearing Elvis's voice, we thought of our own marriages, both crumbling from neglect. I still loved Sandy, but how could I tell her she was the most important thing in my life when I had committed myself to a life that barely included her? It hurt a lot to think that we, too, were starting to feel like strangers. As Joe and I listened with Elvis, he stayed expressionless, but each time the song ended, he'd cue it up, start it again, and look over at us. Then he'd look down and shake his head a bit. You could almost hear the question hanging in the air. What the hell have we done to the women we loved? The next night we were all back at the same studio for another session, one of the few times I'd ever see Elvis's musical instincts off the mark. With all the emotions that had been stirred by Separate Ways still fresh, Elvis was definitely not in the mood to rock. He wanted to sing more songs that would help him express the sadness and loss he was feeling, but Felton had an up-tempo song he felt sure was going to be a hit. Elvis heard it and dismissed it. Felton didn't push, but he eventually got Elvis to give it another listen. I heard the demo too, and though I knew where Elvis's head and heart were from the night before, I could also tell that Felton was right. The song sounded like a hit. I knew not to push, but I supported Felton and encouraged Elvis to give the song a shot. Eventually he did and sang Burning Love. There wasn't any way he could truly put his heart into it, but you couldn't tell that from listening to what was recorded. He did a great, convincing job of sounding up. When he later began to sing the song in concert, he had a kind of psychological block toward it. Elvis, who had close to a photographic memory when it came to books, scripts, lyrics, always insisted that he needed a lyric sheet to perform Burning Love. He might not glance at the sheet he was holding on stage, but he needed to have it with him. He didn't get excited about the song until it turned out that Felton had been right. The song was a hit. And, interestingly enough, with Burning Love, Elvis found himself battling up the pop charts with an old friend. By the fall of 1972, Burning Love had made it to number 2, but couldn't go higher. The number 1 spot was held by Chuck Berry's My Ding-a-Ling. When Elvis began a new national tour in the spring of 1972, there was one significant change in the touring machinery. Now, many of the concerts would be filmed, and the resulting footage would be shaped into an MGM rock and roll documentary feature. This would be the second documentary based on Elvis performances. The first, an MGM production titled That's the Way It Is, had used footage of rehearsals and performances shot during Elvis's August 1970 Las Vegas engagement, when I was still a full-time Paramount employee. The filmmakers undertaking this new project were Bob Abel and Pierre Adage, a pair of young, serious-minded music lovers who had recently completed Mad Dogs and Englishmen, a film that followed Joe Cocker's 1970 American tour. The pair, whose production company was known as Cinema Associates, had been suggested to Elvis and the Colonel by MGM, and they impressed Elvis enough with their sense of purpose that they got the job. Elvis was excited about the project, but I think I was probably more excited. Having Elvis shows and serious documentary work come together in this way seemed like a situation full of possibilities for me. We got used to having cameras rolling around us pretty quickly, and the tour got off to a good start. Elvis was continuing to deliver strong performances before sellout crowds. But with all that going right, there was one career move Elvis wanted to make that didn't ever seem to get any closer to being a reality. Elvis wanted to tour internationally. I sat up with him one night and listened as he talked about how much he wanted to go overseas, how he wanted to perform for fans in England, throughout Europe, and in Japan. He had seen so many Japanese fans make the trip to Las Vegas to see him. Why couldn't he go over there? He felt a responsibility to his fans around the world, and when he talked about wanting to tour internationally, it was with a real passion and an anger that it hadn't happened sooner. "These people have a certain image of me," he said at one point. "I don't want to wait until I'm 40 goddamn years old to get over there." For years I'd seen Elvis's talents hampered by the people around him making decisions based on business and finance, and it seemed like now, finally, he should be free to make his own artistic decisions. He was excited to be performing again, but how many times was he going to be able to put his heart into singing his songs night after night in Las Vegas, or in the same U.S. cities he'd been to the year before? He needed to stay challenged, and touring internationally seemed like precisely the challenge he would rise to. The next day I was scheduled to have a lunch with the Colonel at his invitation, and I decided to bring the issue up. It still felt dangerous to step in between Elvis and the Colonel, but I also knew how deeply Elvis felt about this, and I felt I owed it to him to get some kind of a discussion started. When I told the Colonel what Elvis and I had talked about all night, he was irritated, and clearly didn't want to have the discussion with me. "Jerry, you know Hewlett," he barked. "He knows the situation over there. Why don't you ask him?" Promoter Tom Hewlett had become part of the Elvis world as a partner of Jerry Weintraub's, and their company, Management 3, now handled Elvis's tours. Hewlett was the partner we dealt with most often and most directly, and he and I had become close, usually finding time for a talk together after a show. He was a hip guy, but a tough businessman, too, a former athlete who, in working with Jimi Hendrix and then Led Zeppelin, had just about pioneered the art of putting on a large-scale rock and roll tour. Tom had been brave enough to go up against the old showbiz promotion syndicates on the East and West Coasts, and smart enough that he'd become a great success. I was impressed with the way he carried himself and the way he conducted business, and saw his knowledge and experience as a tremendous asset for Elvis. So that night after the show, following the Colonel's suggestion, I brought up the matter of international touring with Tom. The Colonel had always made it sound like it was just too complicated to ever be resolved, too difficult to work out the travel and promotion and security and guarantees. But Hendrix and Zeppelin and other acts Tom had worked with hadn't seemed to have had any trouble touring all over the globe. I asked if, theoretically, we could work out all the arrangements, and especially the security, for Elvis to perform an engagement in London that could be promoted in other European cities. Tom thought for a moment, then said, "Yeah, I think so." We talked a while about how some of the scheduling would work, and it seemed that, by the end of the night, some forward progress toward Europe had been made. The next day, the Colonel and I were walking together down a hallway in the Hilton Hotel in San Antonio when I told him about my conversation with Tom. "Colonel, Tom said we can do it. He thinks we can work it out if Elvis wants to tour overseas." The Colonel stopped in his tracks, hurled his cane down the hall, turned on me, and hollered, "God damn it, then you handle him!" There were two messages that became very clear to me in that hallway. I was not actually being requested to handle Elvis in any way, and we wouldn't be going to London any time soon. Having a documentary film crew around while on tour with Elvis, I felt I was in the middle of everything I wanted to be a part of. The dream of being an editor on an Elvis film, working with him on some kind of creative level, seemed entirely possible now, but it required patience and some careful steps. As tight as Elvis and I had become on the road, I didn't want to give him the impression that I would jump ship easily. And I knew that after making their way through all the Colonel's hoops and hassles, the filmmakers had no desire to invite an Elvis guy into their offices. But when the filming was done, and we had finished a second leg of the tour, I did talk to Elvis about trying to get involved with the film. I think he'd gotten used to having these kinds of talks with me by then, but this felt a lot different from the last time I'd asked to part ways with him. This time I was secure about my abilities to fend for myself in the world at large, and I was also secure about the strength of the friendship between Elvis and me. I didn't feel like there was any chance this would be a permanent goodbye. I had thought that might be the case the first time, but had found myself right back at Graceland for Christmas, New Year's, and the birth of Lisa Marie. But again, it meant a lot that he gave me his blessing to follow my heart. It wasn't as easy to win over Abel and Adage. I went to their offices one afternoon to formally offer my services as an assistant editor, but was not met with much enthusiasm. I could sense that they were very hesitant about having a member of Elvis's inner circle working on an Elvis project. I liked these guys and the way they'd worked with Elvis, and I didn't want to push too hard. So I told them if my connection with Elvis disqualified me from the Elvis film, maybe they could let me work on their other film project, a celebration of 50s rock and roll called Let the Good Times Roll. Somehow that request changed the way they looked at me. I guess they figured that if this Elvis guy wasn't necessarily looking for work on the Elvis film, he had to be serious about the film side of things. And it must have struck them that, given the fact that I had some real editing experience, I was probably not just a spy sent by Elvis or the Colonel. Finally, I suppose they saw the value of having a way to get to Elvis other than going through the Colonel. Within a few days, I completed my next career turn and began as an entry-level assistant editor with Cinema Associates, working on Elvis on Tour. Almost immediately, I had a chance to serve Elvis and the film in a unique way. A young filmmaker named Marty Scorsese was working as an editor on the film. He'd already done a brilliant job as part of the editing team on Woodstock, and one of the special sequences he was overseeing was a montage of early photographs of Elvis, a flowing visual history of his career. When the Colonel heard that this was a part of the film, he nixed it, telling Abel and Adage that Elvis did not want any old photographs of him to be a part of the project. I knew that the facts were a little different. Elvis had complained to the Colonel about the use of old photographs, but he was talking about their use on new album covers. I had a feeling that if Elvis got a sense of how the montage fit into the film, he'd have no problem with it. I went over to the Montevale house one night, and when the time seemed right, explained to Elvis how the montage worked shot by shot, how it fit with the music and built up the tour footage. He got it right away. "Sounds good. I don't have any trouble with that," he told me. I brought his okay back to the filmmakers. The Scorsese montage was in, and the film was better off for it. Over that one film sequence, I had taken the huge step of being able to approach Elvis as a fellow creative. Not a creative equal, of course, but it felt huge to be with him, discussing film edits rather than sit-ups.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.